Picture a rented apartment in San Francisco, velvet curtains, a mirrored wall that isn't really a mirror, a glass set on the nightstand with something extra swirling in it. On the far side of that mirror, a couple of men in shirt sleeves lean closer, taking notes, barely blinking. You're not in a spy movie. You're inside a real CIA program with a name that sounds made up, MK Ultra. At the height of the Cold War, the fear wasn't just bombs, it was minds. Could a mind be bent, guided, programmed? Could a person be nudged to confess, to forget, to obey? In that race, the CIA opened a door it couldn't easily close. MK Ultra became the umbrella label for a tangle of secret projects exploring drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and other techniques that were sold to the public as science fiction, until the paperwork surfaced. The guiding figure was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, a quiet man with a government badge and a very large mandate. With his approval, the agency spread money through front foundations into universities, hospitals, and clinics. Some researchers knew who was paying, many didn't. Students signed up for volunteer studies and wound up on wild psychedelic trips they hadn't actually agreed to. Prisoners traded time off their sentence for experiments they couldn't fully understand. Mental health patients were treated with methods that had nothing to do with healing. And then there was the star of the show, LSD. It was new. It was unpredictable. It seemed to slip under the guardrails of the mind. Agents dosed themselves in office testing parties and swore the colours in their filing cabinets were trying to escape. Others dosed unwitting targets to watch what happened when reality tilted. Panic, laughter, tears, paranoia. One famous case followed an army scientist named Frank Olson who was given LSD without his knowledge and spiraled. Days later, he fell from a New York hotel window. Officially, it was a tragic suicide. Decades later, the family pushed for answers and the questions only multiplied. In MK Ultra, the line between research and wreckage got very blurry. Cross the border to Montreal and you find Dr. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute running depatterning and psychic driving experiments funded through CIA-linked channels. Patients came in with common problems, anxiety, postpartum depression, and ended up subjected to heavy doses of drugs, extended sleep, and recorded messages looped for hours on end. Imagine going to a hospital for help and waking up months later with your memory chewed full of holes. When these stories broke, they didn't sound like medicine. They sounded like nightmares. So how did we find out? Two words that, in this context, are almost magic. Paper trail. In the mid-1970s, after Watergate blew open the idea that the government might not always tell the truth, Congress created a special investigation, the Church Committee, to look at intelligence abuses. Former CIA Director Richard Helms had already ordered MK Ultra files destroyed, but bureaucracy is stubborn. Not everything went into the shredder. In 1977, a cache of surviving financial records turned up through a Freedom of Information Act request, and suddenly there were dates, memos, invoices. Witnesses were called. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a record. What the record showed was messy. Unwitting subjects. Cover arrangements. Safe houses. That last word leads us back to the velvet curtains and the mirrored wall. The agency didn't want sterile labs. It wanted life as it was actually lived, with all the messy human motives attached. So they set up real apartments in real neighborhoods. Guests thought they were there for a good time. In reality, the scene was bait. The CIA spiked the drinks, watched through glass, and scribbled notes while the night unfolded. If your jaw is halfway to the floor right now, that's the correct position. Were they searching for a magic switch, a hypnotic code phrase, a drug mix that unlocked a person like a safe? The documents don't show a single master trick, no Manchurian candidate button, but they do show a bureaucracy determined to try everything that seemed even remotely plausible. It wasn't just LSD. There were experiments with barbiturates and stimulants administered back-to-back to push people into confessional states. There were trials with hypnosis layered over drugs. There were isolation tanks where silence became its own kind of pressure. The moral math was always upside down. National security was the excuse stamped at the top of the folder. Consent and dignity were the pages underneath, crumpled. Some participants were told almost nothing, others were told just enough to sign a form that didn't describe what was actually coming. When you strip away the acronyms and the Cold War jargon, you're left with a simple truth. People were used. One reason MK Ultra still hits like a thunderclap is because it flips the usual skepticism on its head. The public had heard whispers, mind control, LSD, spy tricks, and rolled their eyes. Then official investigators said, actually, yes, a lot of that happened. Senate hearings, declassified memos, FOIA releases. It's rare for something that sounds like Pulp Fiction to show up with an evidence trail thick enough to trip over. And remember, most of the files were destroyed. What we know is a silhouette drawn from what survived. If that outline already looks disturbing, imagine the detail that never made it to daylight. You don't need imagination to be outraged. The known facts are heavy enough, but the known facts also give us something else: clarity. When people talk about conspiracy theories that turned out to be true, MK Ultra isn't just a headliner. It's the origin story for why so many folks learn to raise an eyebrow when officials say, "Trust us." So where does this story go next? If MK Ultra was the umbrella, there were storms underneath it. Some were so surreal they sound like urban legends until you read the receipts. One of them involved those San Francisco apartments, a two-way mirror, and a program name you won't forget once you hear it. If you think MK Ultra was wild in the lab, wait until we step into the safe houses of Operation Midnight Climax. Walk into a little apartment in San Francisco's Telegraph Hill in the late 1950s. The drapes are heavy. The lighting is flattering. There's a bar cart with crystal decanters, a velvet couch, and a mirror that isn't really a mirror. Hidden behind it, microphones, a reel-to-reel recorder, and a man in a chair with a notebook and a drink, watching every second. Welcome to the CIA's most brazen field lab, Operation Midnight Climax. The host of this show was not a lab-coat scientist. He was George Hunter White, a larger-than-life narcotics agent on loan to the CIA, equal parts cop, bon vivant, and chaos coordinator. White dressed loud, drank hard, used colourful aliases, and loved creative operations. The agency gave him a handful of safe-house apartments, first in San Francisco, later in New York, and the green light to run real-world behavioural experiments. The goal was as simple as it was slippery. Figure out what people say and do under the influence, and what tricks might loosen a tongue. How do you stage those experiments without tipping anyone off? You make the setting feel like a private party, not a clinic. White hired sex workers, paid them well, and told them to bring clients by for a good time. The guests were poured cocktails, martinis, highballs, something smooth, and some of those drinks were laced with LSD. On the other side of the two-way mirror, White and colleagues leaned in, listening to conversations, watching body language, taking notes on what made people brag, confess, or shut down. In some cases, they played with lighting, music, little environmental nudges, anything to see what pushed a mood from guarded to loose. It was not science the way you imagine science. There were no double-blind trials, no standardized doses carefully logged in a pristine ledger. This was the messiness of real life, with real people who did not consent, moving through real temptations: sex, alcohol, novelty, risk. The CIA's logic was blunt. If we ever try to manipulate someone in the wild, it won't be in a lab. So let's learn in the wild. What did they look for? A few things. First, the truth serum fantasy. Would a person under the influence spill secrets they'd otherwise guard? Second, leverage. What made someone more suggestible, more compliant, more eager to please? Third, tradecraft. Could an operative keep control of a conversation while a target was high, or steer them toward a reveal? The notes from these safe houses read less like medical records and more like a noir screenplay. Who walked in, what they drank, how quickly their mask slipped, whether they bragged, panicked, got suspicious, or tried to impress. If you're picturing a born-again psychologist with a clipboard, adjust the image. George White famously treated the safe houses like his domain, parties with a purpose. He stocked the bar. He decorated the rooms with erotic art to set tone. He sometimes tested doses on himself or colleagues because, in that era of intelligence work, bad ideas could be packaged as bold ideas if you said national security with a straight face. It was outrageous, yes. It also produced exactly the kind of dirt-under-the-fingernails observations a bureaucracy can convince itself are valuable. What lines work, what lines don't, how quickly paranoia takes over, how long a subject stays chatty before they crash into silence. Did they find a magic formula? Number LSD did not unlock reliable truth, and a mirror full of spooks didn't turn liars honest. If anything, the safe houses showed the limits of chemical shortcuts. Some people got euphoric and talkative, others got anxious, confused, or angry. Timing, dose, setting, expectations, everything mattered, which is another way of saying the agency's dream of a push-button confession stayed a dream. But even failed science can be a successful operation if your real aim is experience, learning how targets behave in compromised situations and how handlers keep control. The ethical disaster is obvious. No meaningful consent, no informed choice. People were used as props in an experiment they didn't know existed. The sex workers were put in a strange middle position too, paid and protected by handlers, but used as instruments in something far bigger than they were told. If you strip out the spycraft, what remains is a simple, grim fact. The government spiked drinks, watched through glass, and took notes on human beings who believed they were in private. So how did any of this come to light? Paper, again. The CIA's director at the time later ordered MK records destroyed, but not every memo dies when it's told to. Expense reports, routing slips, surviving sub-project files, and the memories of people who were there eventually bubbled up. In the mid-1970s, congressional investigators started pulling threads. Freedom of Information Act requests unearthed surviving paperwork. The nickname, Midnight Climax, was so absurd it sounded like a prank until the documents spelled it out in cold type. Safe houses, two-way mirrors, recording gear, dosed cocktails, behavioral observation. When the story became public, it read like a dare. Here is the line you thought we wouldn't cross. We crossed it. The CIA, under pressure, folded the safe houses and the broader LSD circus as the 1960s ended and oversight tightened. George White retired, wrote flamboyant letters about his career, and left behind diaries that later researchers would mine for details. The agency framed the whole episode as a product of a fearful time, a Cold War moonshot into the mind that went too far, learned too little, and got shut down. The lesson people took was different. If a program with a name this ridiculous could be real, if an ordinary apartment could be a covert lab, if a mirror could be a wall with eyes, then the idea that they'd never do that lost a lot of power. Midnight Climax didn't just break trust. It broke imagination's speed limit. It taught a generation that reality sometimes says yes to the most unflattering version of itself. And remember, this was one branch of the MKUltra tree. The roots ran into universities, hospitals, prisons, and clinics. The leaves touched lives that never got an apology. The safe houses are unforgettable because they're cinematic. But some of the darkest work happened under fluorescent lights, with white coats and clipboards, and a soft reassurance that this is for your own good. Which brings us to a case where the setting wasn't a spy den at all. It was a public health program with official letterhead, doctors in charge, and a promise of care that turned out to be a lie. If you want to see how a conspiracy can hide in plain sight inside the words study and treatment, we need to talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Walk into a county clinic in Macon County, Alabama in the 1930s. The sign on the door says the U.S. Public Health Service is running a special program. Men arrive in their Sunday best. They've been told they have bad blood. a catch-all phrase that could mean anything from anemia to fatigue, and the government is offering free checkups, hot meals on visit days, and burial insurance when the time comes. There are nurses with warm smiles and clipboards. There are doctors with white coats and reassuring voices. It looks like care. It feels like help. It wasn't help. The Tuskegee study began in 1932 as a project to watch untreated syphilis in black men over time. Not cure, not treat. Just observe what the disease does to the body if you leave it alone. About 600 men were enrolled. Most poor sharecroppers, many unable to read the papers that would have told them what they were signing. Roughly 2/3 had syphilis. The rest were used as controls. They weren't told they had a sexually transmitted infection. They were told they had bad blood, and then they were guided, gently and persistently, away from treatment. If you're wondering how anyone could justify that, here's the trick. In 1932, there wasn't a reliable cure. Arsenic compounds and mercury salves were as likely to harm as to help, so some researchers convinced themselves that simply observing would be valuable science. That rationalization collapsed in the 1940s when penicillin became the standard, effective treatment for syphilis. At that moment, the ethical choice was obvious. Call the men, treat the disease, end the study. Instead, the program closed ranks. Staff wrote letters to local draft boards to keep participants from getting penicillin during military physicals. Clinic notes were coded to make sure outside doctors didn't accidentally fix the study material. Beneath the paperwork was a human face the men trusted, Nurse Eunice Rivers. She sat in their kitchens, scheduled rides, promised steady care. To the participants, she was the program. To the program, she was the bridge that kept men enrolled and compliant. It's one of the cruelest details. The study wrapped itself in the rituals of kindness, home visits, friendly reminders, a ride to the clinic, while quietly ensuring that the one thing that would actually help was kept out of reach. Decade after decade, the disease did what the disease does. Syphilis, untreated, is patient and destructive. It moves through stages, sores, rashes, quiet periods where it seems to vanish, and then the late knock on the door. Heart damage, blindness, neurological collapse. Wives were infected. Children were born with congenital syphilis. No one explained why a free clinic never seemed to include the cure that the rest of the country had been using for years. Why did it keep going? Because it could. Because authorities stamped research on the file and shut the drawer. Because the men were poor and black, and the system was designed to ignore their pain. And because once a bad idea gets institutionalized, it grows a bureaucracy to defend it. Memos, progress reports, polite conferences where people speak in a language that makes suffering sound like a line on a chart. It took a whistle and a headline to stop it. In the mid-1960s, a young public health service employee raised concerns internally and was brushed off. He raised them again. Eventually, in 1972, a reporter ran the story, and the country saw what had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, the actual title, read like a confession. Congressional hearings followed. The program was shut down. Lawsuits were filed and settled. Decades later, a US president stood before the surviving participants and their families and apologized on behalf of the nation. It's tempting, when you hear conspiracy, to picture trench coats and code names. Tuskegee is the opposite. No shadows, no secret apartments, no mirrored glass. Just clipboards, consent forms that weren't really consent, and a steady campaign to keep life-saving medicine out of reach. The lie wasn't shouted, it was murmured through the routine of care. That's why this story sticks, because it shows how wrongdoing can wear the costume of help and be believed. And here's the part that matters for anyone listening and thinking, how do I know what to trust? Not every abuse is wild and cinematic. Some of the worst ones follow the rules on paper and betray the people in practice. Tuskegee taught the country to ask basic questions we should have been asking all along. What's the purpose? Who benefits? What happens if I say no? It sharpened the idea of informed consent from a polite phrase into a real obligation. It changed research ethics, institutional review, and the way we think about power in a lab coat. If you're keeping score at home, note the pattern forming. In MKUltra and Midnight Climax, people were used without consent in the name of security. In Tuskegee, people were used without consent in the name of science. Different badges, same shrug at basic dignity. Now let's turn the lens to a different kind of betrayal, one that didn't even pretend to be treatment. After the era of open-air nuclear testing, scientists wanted to know how radioactive fallout moved through the human body. The question was scientific. The way they answered it was not. They took tissue, often from the very young, without permission, in a program with a sunny name that feels chilling once you know what it did. It was called Project Sunshine. They gave it a friendly name, Project Sunshine. It sounds like a children's book. In reality, it began in cold rooms with steel tables and little tags tied to little toes. After the era of open-air nuclear testing kicked radioactive dust into the wind, scientists needed to answer a hard question: how much fallout was ending up inside human bodies, especially inside the young, whose growing bones act like magnets for certain isotopes. The big worry was strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear explosions that behaves like calcium. If it's in the air and the milk and the water, it can wind up in your bones and teeth. And once it's there, it doesn't just sit politely. So the US Atomic Energy Commission launched a program to measure that invisible footprint. On paper, it sounds neat and clean: collect samples from around the world, analyze them, map the trend lines. But the way many of those samples were gathered was neither neat nor clean. Hospitals, morgues, and medical schools quietly provided human tissue, often bones, from the deceased, including infants and children, without permission from families. Sometimes the remains were shipped across borders. Sometimes pathologists were told not to worry about consent because this was for research. And sometimes, tragically, parents were never told that their child's body had been returned for burial lighter than when it left. Why the focus on the very young? Because their bodies incorporate calcium at high speed, building skeletons, building teeth, and strontium-90 tags along. If you want a sensitive indicator of fallout in the food chain, you test baby bones and baby teeth. The science goal wasn't imaginary, it was urgent. But the method crossed a line that should have been bright and obvious. You cannot take from the dead, especially from grieving families, without asking. Project Sunshine wasn't a single lab with a sign on the door. It was a network. AEC contractors, university researchers, overseas partners, an archipelago of people who could get access to remains and ship small labelled pieces to central labs. Memos spoke calmly about specimens and availability. There were tables of target numbers from different continents, as if a human rib or a child's femur were no more complicated than a soil core. In some meetings, officials fretted about the supply problem, meaning the difficulty of quietly obtaining enough bones. That phrase tells you everything about the mindset. The supply wasn't consent. The supply was bodies. How did this come to light? Paper trails and time. Minutes from mid-1950s AEC committees survived, internal correspondence surfaced. Journalists and historians, digging decades later, found the bland bureaucratic language that makes your stomach drop, ordinary words describing extraordinary trespass. The shock wasn't only that it happened, it was how routine it looked on the page. No coded villain speech, just logistics. The data, once measured, told a real story. Levels of strontium-90 in human bones rose during peak atmospheric testing. Milk carried the signal. So did baby teeth. In St. Louis, a related university project collected tens of thousands of children's shed teeth to chart the same curve. Those numbers collided with public fear and moral instinct and helped push leaders toward the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, which moved nuclear tests underground and dramatically reduced global fallout. In a bitter twist, the ends, evidence strong enough to change policy, arrived through means that violated the very people the science was supposed to protect. If you're listening and thinking, couldn't they have just asked? That's the point. In many cases, they didn't even try. Consent slows things down. Grief complicates spreadsheets. Ethics add friction. Sunshine ran on the opposite fuel, urgency plus authority. Scientists wanted answers fast. Officials wanted reassuring graphs. Families, poor and powerless, were the easiest to ignore. When the story finally broke in public, the most searing accounts weren't from laboratories. They were from parents who learned, years later, that parts of their children had been taken and studied under a cute project name. There's a pattern forming in this episode list, and Sunshine slides right into it. In MK Ultra and Midnight Climax, the word security was used to justify treating humans like test material. In Tuskegee, the word study did the same job. In Sunshine, the key words were science and public safety. None of those are bad words. They become bad when they are used as a shield to push people out of the moral frame. What do we do with this knowledge? Two things. First, call it what it was, a real conspiracy, planned, funded, coordinated, to obtain human remains without consent for government-backed research. Second, recognize the complicated truth that good information can be gathered by bad methods, and that the presence of useful data doesn't erase the harm done to get it. If anything, it raises the bar for what we demand from our institutions. Get the data, yes, but earn it. Project Sunshine ends with two lessons that pull in opposite directions, and both matter. Radiation is real, and measuring its path through the world can save lives. People are not just sources of data, and ignoring that truth will poison the best intentions. You don't have to pick one lesson or the other. You can carry both. From morgues and lab benches, let's step outside, literally outside. The next case wasn't about what scientists found inside the body after the fact. It was about what the military released into the air on purpose over an unwitting city to watch how it spread. A test with a code name as bland as a shipping label and a fallout that went far beyond charts. It was called Operation Sea Spray. San Francisco wakes up to fog like it's a house pet. It curls around the hills, slides down the alleys, taps the windows, and wanders off. In September 1950, the fog rolled in as usual, only this time it carried a secret, a fine mist released from a Navy ship sitting offshore. The code name was plain as cardboard, Operation Sea Spray. The idea was simple and cold. If an enemy ever used a biological agent on an American city, how far would it travel? How fast would it spread? Where would the air carry it? Rather than guess on a chalkboard, the military decided to test the question on a living city without telling the people who lived there. They chose two tracer bacteria they believed were harmless to healthy folks. Serratia marquescens, it grows with a reddish pigment you can spot easily in a petri dish, and a relative of Bacillus that was thought to be a safe stand-in for worse things. The plan: spray a cloud into the coastal wind and then quietly measure where it landed. Picture it: a ship a few miles out. Technicians open the sprayers and a barely visible plume drifts toward shore. In the city, the testers have already set up sampling stations, sticky plates on rooftops and windowsills, collectors in courtyards and alleyways, places where the air is funneled or slowed. Over the next day, they check those plates and count the tiny red dots that bloom. Each dot is a colony that started with a single cell, carried by the wind, landed by chance. Plot enough dots on a map, and you get the answer the planners wanted. The fog is not just scenic, it's a delivery system. Nobody sent a memo to residents, no one put up a sign. People went about their lives, streetcars, markets, Little Italy's kitchens steaming up with lunchtime sauces. In hospitals, doctors did what doctors do: rounds, tests, checklists, clipboards. Then something odd, a cluster of rare infections with Serratia, a bacterium that wasn't usually seen causing disease there. One patient, a man recovering from surgery, developed a serious infection and died. Others were treated and survived. At the time, physicians couldn't know that the city had just been used as an open-air lab. Decades later, when documents surfaced and reporters started asking questions, the story clicked into place. Yes, the military had released test bacteria over San Francisco in 1950 to study aerosol spread. Yes, they'd measured it across the city. Yes, nobody had asked permission. On the question everyone cared about, did the test cause the infections, the official line walked a tightrope. The tracer was considered harmless. Direct causation can't be proven. Families called that answer what it sounded like, a shrug wearing a uniform. Strip away the euphemisms and you see the logic that kept repeating in this era. Real-world data beats lab theory. The wind is messy. Cities are messy. People are messy. If you want to know how a cloud moves, you don't simulate. You spray. The problem wasn't the curiosity. It was the quiet. Citizens were treated like background scenery in an experiment done to them, not with them. The planners worried about confounding variables in their dispersion models. They didn't worry enough about consent. Sea spray reads like a parable about how good intentions and bad methods make each other worse. The question, could an attack disperse across a city, was worth answering. The way they answered it planted something toxic, the feeling that your government might use your home as a chalkboard without telling you, and once that seed is planted, trust doesn't grow back quickly. The details that stick are small and human, the lab plates blooming with neat red dots that looked like candy sprinkles, the polite procedural language in internal memos about test articles and urban topography. The ship offshore in the morning fog, grey on grey, with a handful of people on deck who knew exactly what was drifting toward coffee shops and schoolyards. None of them had to look anyone in the eye when they turned on the sprayer. That part happened on land later. What did the test prove? That a single release could spread across much of the city, reaching into neighbourhoods like a whisper. It also proved something the planners didn't put on the chart, that the line between harmless tracer and real harm isn't as clear as you hope when you're drawing it in a briefing book. People aren't lab mice. Cities aren't wind tunnels. When you roll the dice with millions of lungs, even a low risk looks different. You can hear the refrain building in this series. MKUltra, secrecy justified by security. Tuskegee, deception justified by science. Project Sunshine, trespass justified by public safety. Sea Spray adds another verse, testing justified by, it's just a tracer. Each time the words make sense on a podium and fall apart at street level. We've been outside in the fog, now we're going back inside, to fluorescent corridors, quiet wards, and rooms where trust is supposed to be automatic. This next chapter isn't about air drifting over a city, it's about needles, IV bags, lead aprons, and consent forms that didn't tell the whole truth. In the Cold War rush to understand radiation, in medicine, in weapons, in everything, real people were used as test material without fully knowing it. The bland official title later put it all in one file: Human Radiation Experiments. Hospitals feel safe because the rules feel clear. You sign a form, a doctor explains. A nurse checks your bracelet, your pulse, your name. In the middle of the 20th century, under the glow of the Cold War, those rules bent. In some places, they broke. What we now file under a calm title, Human Radiation Experiments, wasn't one program, but a scattered constellation of studies carried out by universities, hospitals, the military, and national labs. The through line wasn't villain mustaches. It was the belief that the nuclear age had changed the stakes enough to justify cutting corners on consent. Start at the beginning of that age, the Manhattan Project. Alongside designing the bomb, government scientists asked a question with no textbook answer. What does plutonium do inside a human body? The most direct way to find out would have been unthinkable in daylight. So they did it in shadows. A handful of hospital patients with serious illnesses were secretly injected with microgram quantities of plutonium so researchers could track how it moved through blood, bone, and organs. Those patients weren't told what they were being given or why. Their names were later replaced by code numbers in reports. For decades, even their families didn't know. Fast forward to the 1950s and 60s, and the same pattern keeps turning up in different coats. At a respected university hospital, pregnant women were given vitamin drinks that actually contained radioactive iron to measure how quickly a mother and fetus absorb it. The women weren't told about the radiation, they were told about nutrition. At a state school for children with developmental disabilities, boys were fed breakfast oatmeal spiked with radioactive tracers to study calcium and iron uptake. The paperwork framed it as a special science club with field trips and prizes. The parents signed forms that didn't say what was really in the spoon. Meanwhile, in hospital radiotherapy suites, doctors and Pentagon funders converged on another question. What does whole-body radiation do to a person? The Cincinnati experiments became a lightning rod years later because the design looked so stark. Cancer patients, mostly poor, many black, were exposed to high doses of total body gamma radiation, sometimes at levels chosen more to simulate battlefield exposure than to treat the individual. The data were tidy: blood counts, nausea timelines, organ responses. The human outcomes weren't. Some patients died soon after. Others suffered without benefiting medically. Consent forms were vague or misleading. Families learned long after the fact that their loved one's treatment had been designed as much for defense questions as for care. None of this was a single evil mastermind scheme. It was a system-level habit. Call something a study, tuck the messy details in the fine print, and keep the samples moving to the lab. Bureaucracy did the rest. Proposals were written in soothing, technical language. Oversight, where it existed, was friendly or asleep. Results were published in medical journals with the aura of normalcy that a citation list provides. If anyone asked hard questions, they were told the era demanded answers. Fallout in the milk supply, radiation in the bones, battlefields we hoped never to see. How did the curtain finally lift? A familiar path, a few whistleblowers, a few persistent journalists, and the long fuse of the Freedom of Information Act. By the early 1990s, the trickle became a flood. The White House convened the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, ACHRE, to dig through boxes, identify the studies, and ask the questions that should have been asked before anyone touched a syringe. The committee's 1995 report didn't just list experiments, it mapped how ordinary institutions had normalized extraordinary trespasses. It also recommended compensation for victims and changes to the rules so "never again" became more than a speech line. If you strip the technical wrap off these stories, what's left is simple. People were used without being told the truth. Some were already vulnerable, sick, poor, institutionalized, pregnant, and that vulnerability was treated like a laboratory convenience. The defense was always the same, in one dialect or another. We needed the data. The nation needed the data. The risk seemed low. We thought it would be okay. Sometimes the science produced valuable knowledge. That doesn't launder the method. The presence of a useful graph doesn't retroactively create consent. You can hear the echo of earlier chapters here. MKUltra said security and spiked the drink. Tuskegee said study and withheld the cure. Project Sunshine said public safety and took from the dead. The radiation experiments said medicine and folded research questions into treatment rooms where patients thought every dose was for them. That ambiguity, am I a patient or a data point, is exactly what modern ethics rules are built to prevent. You shouldn't have to guess which role you're playing when you're wearing a hospital gown. If this all feels heavy, it's because it is. But it's also clarifying. It shows you how mundane language can smuggle in bad choices. It reminds you that institutions need friction, review boards, nosy reporters, families who ask, "What is this exactly?" to keep power from sliding downhill. From radiation we move to chemicals, the kind designed not to heal, but to incapacitate or kill. For 2 decades, soldiers at a US Army post were volunteered, assigned or persuaded into a maze of tests with nerve agents, tear gases and exotic psychoactive compounds. The setting wasn't a secret apartment or a civilian clinic. It was the military itself, wearing its own authority like a lab coat. Next up, Edgewood Arsenal tests. There's a stretch of Maryland shoreline where the woods give way to low brick buildings and long, narrow labs. On the map, it's Edgewood Arsenal. On paper, mid-century, it was where America learned how to fight chemicals with chemicals. In practice, for 2 decades, it was also where thousands of US soldiers found out what volunteer could mean when the army wanted answers fast. Picture a bus door folding open at dawn. Young men step down, duffel bags over their shoulders, expecting the usual. Drills, gear, a lot of hurry up and wait. Instead, they're handed a clipboard and a pitch, special duty, indoors, weekends off, extra pay. You'll be helping the country, someone says, with substances you might encounter on the battlefield. The forms use words like safe, controlled, low dose. They don't say VX, sarin, or a drug that can tangle your thoughts for days. Edgewood wasn't one experiment. It was a menu. On one line, nerve agents, compounds designed to jam the body's signaling so muscles lock, lungs struggle, and a person drowns on dry land. On another line, riot control gases and lacrimators, tear makers, crowd breakers. On a third, psychoactive compounds ranging from familiar, LSD, to exotic, powerful anticholinergics like BZ, a delirium agent nicknamed the Man-Breaker. The army wanted numbers. How fast does a pistol grip slip from a sweaty hand? How long before a driver's reaction time slides? What dose turns a confident corporal into someone who can't follow a simple order? The setting looked clinical enough. White walls, observation windows, clipboards. But what happened inside stuck with people in a way that charts don't capture. A soldier breathes a faint vapour, and suddenly the world sounds like it's coming from the wrong side of his ears. Another takes a colourless liquid on the skin and feels his chest tightening like a hand is closing inside it. The mind, compounds, didn't simply make men silly, they pulled the ladder up from under basic thinking. On BZ, time lost its shape. A man might spend hours trying to button a shirt and forget halfway through what a button is. He might laugh at nothing. He might try to walk through a wall because, for a while, the wall isn't there. Edgewood had tasks for everything, stacking blocks, reading eye charts, shooting at a target while someone calls out changing instructions, marching in a circle and counting backward by sevens. The point wasn't to be cruel, it was to measure how a brain and body fail. But the effect could look cruel, especially when the subject didn't know exactly what was in his system. Volunteer often meant uneven consent, briefed on a substance, not told which one, warned about temporary effects, not told that some compounds could scramble thinking for days or leave a hangover of anxiety and fog. Not every dose was dramatic. Many were small nudges meant to quantify the line between functional and compromised. But the programme's scale, the number of men cycled through, the range of agents, the years it ran, 1950s into the mid-70s, made the quiet risks add up. Some soldiers later described panic attacks that never quite left. Others talked about memory gaps, migraines, heart palpitations, chemical sensitivities that arrived after special duty and stayed. For a long time, when they asked the army for records, they got shrugs or photocopies so blacked out they looked like modern art. Why did this happen the way it did? The Cold War logic was blunt. If the enemy used these agents, our people would suffer without a lab coat or a consent form. Better to learn the hard limits now than on a battlefield. And to be fair, some of what Edgewood learned fed into better protective gear, better antidote kits, better decontamination drills. But that, to be fair, can only carry so far. The other half of the ledger includes men who signed up for something they didn't fully grasp and paid a price that wasn't on the brochure. Eventually, the curtain tugged open. Investigations in the 1970s questioned human experimentation across the government, and Edgewood's files, Test rosters, dose logs, agent codes started to surface. Years later, veterans organized, sued, and pressed for care and disclosure. Courts told agencies to do what they should have done in the first place, tell people exactly what they were given, and help them deal with the fallout. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a paper trail catching up to lived experience. If there's a detail that stays with you, make it this: the line between training, testing, and treatment kept blurring. A soldier is conditioned to obey orders, to accept risk, to take one for the team. That culture makes a perfect petri dish for sloppy consent. You don't need a villain twirling a mustache when the system itself is built to say yes to anything stamped readiness. Step back and you can see the chord running through our series so far. MK Ultra and Midnight Climax gambled with minds under the flag of security. Tuskegee and the radiation studies gambled with bodies under the banner of science. Edgewood gambled with both and called it preparedness. The words changed, the posture didn't. We need this, so we'll do this. And we won't explain until someone makes us. From the forests and firing ranges of Maryland, our path arcs across the Pacific to a chain of low coral atolls where the sky glowed white in the 1950s and the wind carried dust no one there had asked for. When the fallout settled, doctors arrived with clipboards, not to offer apologies, but to study what the radiation was doing to the people who lived there. The project number reads like a filing error. The consequences did not. Next up, Project 4.1, Marshall Islands. Dawn on a coral atoll. Palm fronds still, a lagoon like glass. And then snow. Not the cold kind. White grit drifting out of a clear sky, piling on roofs and shoulders and the backs of laughing children who had never seen anything like it. They scooped it up in their hands, they rubbed it into their hair, they let it melt on their tongues. It wasn't snow, it was fallout. On March 1st, 1954, the United States set off a thermonuclear test in the Marshall Islands that was far larger than planners expected. The blast punched a new colour into the sky and threw a cloud high enough to find the winds. Those winds carried pulverized coral and radioactive byproducts across inhabited atolls downrange. By the time the ash settled on villages, the damage was already happening, not with heat and shock, but with particles and time. Within hours there were headaches, nausea, a metallic taste, then burns, rashes that looked like sun poisoning but weren't, hair coming out in clumps. Fishermen at sea noticed the same snow, a chalky dust coating their decks. Back on the islands, people tried to wash it off with water that had its own trace of the sky in it. A few days later, American ships arrived. Sailors and doctors in crisp uniforms came ashore with Geiger counters chattering like insects. The islanders were evacuated, loaded into boats, taken to a military base, bathed, photographed, tested. Their homes, their tools, their water tanks, their breadfruit trees, everything they lived by had been dusted with an invisible ledger that nobody there could read. The scientists could. In the files, the response acquired a label, Project 4.1. It was a study of how fallout affects the human body, especially the thyroid, a small gland in the neck that greedily collects iodine, whether the iodine is the harmless kind you sprinkle on table salt or the radioactive kind that drifts out of a mushroom cloud and into the food chain. The project meant blood draws, urine collections, whole body counts, and long tables of numbers. It also meant a relationship the islanders hadn't chosen. They were now subjects in a study tied to the very event that had uprooted them. There has been debate, even among historians, about whether 4.1 was conceived before the test or written up afterward to organize the response. The paper trail speaks a cautious bureaucrat's dialect: program numbers, task groups, method notes, schedules. On the ground, the lived experience didn't need a memo to feel obvious. People who had never heard the words isotope or beta burn suddenly had doctors measuring their necks and counting their breaths. Families were told not to eat certain fish, to throw out coconuts, to leave gardens alone. They were told they would be moved, then told they could return, then told, years later, that the place they loved was not safe after all. The thyroid story hit hard. Children whose growing bodies use iodine like a construction crew uses cement were the most vulnerable. Some developed enlarged glands, nodules, and later cancers. Women suffered miscarriages and problems with lactation. Men spoke of weakness they couldn't shake. The exams went on for years, teams arriving with notebooks and needles, calibrating their instruments in the tropical heat, while mothers tried to keep toddlers still on clinic benches. Consent is not just a signature on a line, it's comprehension, language, power, and real choice. The Marshallese did not control the bomb that dusted their roofs. They did not choose the study that followed. You can acknowledge that the medical teams treated injuries, removed tumours, and tracked conditions over time, and also say plainly that the relationship was lopsided from the first handshake. The same authorities who caused the exposure were now collecting the data about it. That's a conflict you can feel, even if you can't read a dosimeter. The numbers told a story nobody wanted to hear. Radioactive iodine spiked, then fell. Other fission products lodged in bone, in muscle, in the delicate machinery of the neck. The fallout didn't just sprinkle the ground and disappear. It moved through food and water, through goat's milk and reef fish, and then into people. Over the years, there were relocations meant to protect health that instead shredded culture, new islands with different water, different soil, different memories. There was compensation, sometimes late and always complicated. There were apologies written in the language of statecraft. None of it put the ash back in the cloud. Project 4.1 sits at an uncomfortable crossroads. On one road, urgent knowledge, what fallout does to real people in real environments. On the other, the way that knowledge was gathered, on the bodies of those who never agreed to be a dataset. If you squint only at the graphs, you see important findings that changed how the world thinks about testing and fallout. If you look up from the graphs, you see neighbours who became cases, children who became cohorts, islanders who learned that the white dust they played in was the reason the doctor kept touching their throats. There's an image from this story that won't leave you once it comes in. An elder standing at the edge of a lagoon, pointing to a village that isn't there anymore, explaining to a visitor where the cookhouses used to be, where the breadfruit groves shaded the path, where the children raced after crabs at low tide. The island is still an island on a map, but the place, the lived place, moved. People carried it in their heads because their bodies had to be somewhere else. If you've noticed the pattern building in this series, 4.1 fits it too. The phrase that justifies the trespass keeps changing: security, science, public safety. But the structure rhymes. First the act, then the study, then the tidy report that can't quite hold the human cost. The best you can do with a story like this is name it accurately and draw the lesson where it matters. Whether you're a scientist, a planner, or a citizen, people are not just instruments. Keep one last thought as we pivot. Fallout taught the world how wind carries what we release. In another chapter of this era, someone asked a sharper question. If wind can carry something to our enemies, can we make the wind itself do our work? Not with radiation, but with rain. To bog down supply lines, to wash out roads, to turn a season into a weapon. The code name was mild, the goal wasn't. Next up, Operation Popeye. The clouds over Southeast Asia look soft from a distance. Up close, they're switches. In the late 1960s, the US flipped them. Operation Popeye was a classified weather modification program with a blunt goal: make it rain longer over the Ho Chi Minh Trail so trucks bog down, rivers swell, roads wash out, and supplies slow to a crawl. The slogan, darkly cute in a briefing book, was "Make mud, not war." Here's how it worked. Crews flew under the anvil tops of storm cells and fired silver iodide flares into the clouds, tiny crystals that give water vapour something to cling to. Seed enough clouds and you can nudge a drizzle into a downpour, or push a passing squall into a sticky all-day soak. On paper, it was elegant. In the jungle, it meant rain on top of rain until the clay turned to soup and the night convoys left ruts deep enough to swallow axles. The target wasn't just Vietnam. a lot of the effort focused on Laos, where the trail snaked through valleys and over ridges under forest cover. If you picture an enemy hiding from planes, Popeye's logic clicks. You don't have to see a truck to hurt it if you can turn the road into oatmeal. Logs slide, bridges rot. Drivers time their runs around the weather, so you change the weather. Did it work? Internally, some reports bragged about extended monsoon days and measurable slowdowns. Later looks were cooler. Weather is chaotic and proof is slippery. What isn't slippery is the ethics. The operation was secret, from the public, from most of Congress, and from the people living beneath those clouds. Villagers didn't know why the season felt heavier, why crops stood in water too long, why paths stayed slick week after week. Secrecy didn't hold forever. A journalist nudged the story into daylight. Hearings followed. Senators asked a simple question with a long echo. Should we be weaponizing the weather? That question helped push the world toward a new line in the sand, the 1977 International Convention Against Hostile Environmental Modification. If you're looking for a direct line from sounds like science fiction to we need a treaty, this is it. Why does Popeye belong in a list of conspiracies that turned out to be true? Because it hides in plain English. Cloud seeding sounds like farm talk. Environmental modification sounds like a campus seminar. But the reality was pilots under thunderheads, lighting off flares, turning rain into a tool. No masks, no melodrama, just a quiet tweak that changed what fell out of the sky. Next, we go from altering the weather to faking the storm, a plan written in a Pentagon office that proposed staged acts to manufacture a reason for war. It never happened, but the memo is chilling and very real. Operation Northwoods. In a Pentagon office in 1962, a typewriter clacked through a memo with a painfully bland title, A Plan to Create Pretexts for Invading Cuba. The idea wasn't to wait for a crisis, it was to manufacture one. The code name you've heard is Operation Northwoods. The backdrop was the Cold War at a boil. Castro had thrown out a US-backed dictator, embraced Moscow, and weathered the Bay of Pigs. Inside the Pentagon, some brass wanted a clean excuse to end the experiment next door. Northwoods offered a menu of made-for-headlines events that could be blamed on Havana to justify open war, events that felt real enough to move Congress and the public. The proposals read like a thriller outline typed by a very sober bureaucrat. Stage a communist terror campaign in Miami and Washington using planted operatives. Harass civil aircraft and shipping, then publicize the danger. Blow up a US ship at Guantanamo Bay and point the finger at Cuban saboteurs, complete with casualty lists designed to inflame outrage. One of the most chilling ideas, fake the shoot-down of a passenger plane by swapping a real airliner for a drone and landing the passengers elsewhere, then broadcasting the loss as an act of Cuban aggression. There were even notes about staging funerals and planting wreckage to sell the story. If you're thinking, surely someone said no, someone did. The plan made it up the chain to the civilian leadership, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and President John F. Kennedy, and it was rejected. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, Lyman Lemnitzer, soon rotated out. Northwoods never left the page. But the page exists. That's the point. It surfaced decades later in declassified files, and it lands with a thud because it punctures a comforting assumption that they would never plan something like that. They did plan it, they didn't do it. Both facts matter. Northwoods is a lesson in how far ends justify the means thinking can travel inside a secure conference room. The authors didn't sound like movie villains. They sounded like staff officers trying to solve a political problem with stagecraft. They anticipated the media cycle, dramatic images, tidy narratives, a villain already chosen. They built in theatrics, wreckage, mourning, headlines, because they understood that outrage is a lever. It's also a reminder that civilian oversight isn't just a slogan. In this case, it worked. A wild plan hit a hard stop and died in a folder. The next time someone says every conspiracy is nonsense, Northwoods is a simple reply. Sometimes the unbelievable is in black and white. The safeguard is who has the pen last. We've spent Act 1 in the realm of covert labs, secret tests, and a blueprint for a war that didn't happen. Act 2 opens with a conspiracy that did happen, over years across cities, aimed not at foreign armies but at citizens and activists at home. The name is as dry as a file label, and the methods were anything but. COINTELPRO. Open the file drawer and the label looks harmless. COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program. Inside, from 1956 to 1971, the FBI ran a quiet, rolling campaign to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize people it considered threats. Some were genuine extremists. Many were citizens using their rights, civil rights leaders, anti-war organizers, student groups, Puerto Rican independence activists, the American Indian movement, even journalists and academics who asked the wrong questions. This wasn't just wiretaps, it was a toolkit. Infiltration, plant an informant, then push for chaos, poison pen letters, anonymous notes to spouses, donors, pastors, employers. Do you know what he's really up to? Forgeries, fake flyers to pit allies against each other, smear campaigns, leaks to reporters to brand an opponent subversive, a word designed to end a career. Black bag jobs, break-ins for photos, lists, personal letters that could be twisted into leverage. The goal wasn't arrest so much as erosion, make targets spend their energy fighting rumors, lawyers, each other. You can draw a straight line to names you know. Martin Luther King Jr. was wiretapped under a national security pretext. His hotel rooms bugged, his private life harvested for a plan that grew into an infamous anonymous letter urging him to kill himself. The Black Panther Party faced deep infiltration. Informants goaded splits and violence and shared floor plans with police. Student groups were mapped and seeded with provocateurs. The Ghetto Informant Program recruited men on corners and in barbershops to report climate in black neighborhoods. Each memo used professional language. Each action pushed on the same bruise: trust. So how did this come to light? A small group of activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania in 1971 and mailed stolen files to reporters. The documents described COINTELPRO in the Bureau's own words. The shame was official enough that the program was shut down, and, a few years later, the Church Committee in the U.S. Senate dragged the practices into daylight. Domestic surveillance beyond the law, harassment campaigns, political policing. Two things can be true at once. The FBI had legitimate targets, violent groups, foreign fronts, and it crossed lines that a democracy can't afford to cross, spying on lawful dissent, manipulating the press, trying to break a minister with anonymous mail. That mixture is why COINTELPRO still echoes. It didn't just punish bad actors, it taught whole communities that the phone might click, the new volunteer might be an informant, and the next scandalous flyer might be a fake. When you salt a movement with paranoia, it's hard for anything to grow. Hold on to one thread as we move forward. The government didn't just watch King, it tried to break him. The next chapter drills into that letter, what it said, how it was sent, and why it remains one of the ugliest artifacts in the archive, the FBI's MLK suicide letter. Open the envelope on the kitchen table and out slides a reel of tape and a typed letter. The voice on the tape is yours. Hotel room wiretaps stitched into a shame montage. The letter is unsigned, written as if from a disgusted black admirer. It calls you a fraud. It says the country will soon hear everything. And then it lands the punch. There is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. This was the FBI's suicide letter to Martin Luther King Jr. In late 1964, weeks before he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, a package arrived at King's home. The Bureau had been wiretapping him under a national security pretext. Now, someone inside took the next step, compile intimate recordings, and add a poison pen letter urging him to take his own life rather than face public exposure. It even set a deadline, counting down days like a bomb timer. This wasn't a rogue prank, it fit a program. Under COINTELPRO, the FBI's leadership had labelled King a target to be neutralised. They tapped phones, bugged hotel rooms, and prodded friendly reporters with innuendo. The letter distilled that strategy into a single vile document. If you can't beat the man's message, break the man. King didn't fold. He recognised the package for what it was, an attempt to push him off a cliff. He told a tight circle, kept moving, and walked onto the Nobel stage with the country's eyes on him, not the Bureau's tape. But the damage wasn't zero. Imagine living with that pressure, knowing your phone might click, your room might hum, your mail might carry a threat dressed up as concern. The letter tried to make him carry his own eraser. How did the world find out? Years later, investigations pried open the Bureau's files. The letter surfaced in archives. The Senate's Church Committee put it on the record. Historians traced its style to a senior FBI official. The myth that surveillance is just listening died a little that day. Here it was used as a weapon, not a tool. When people hear conspiracy, they often think of elaborate myths. The King letter is simpler and uglier. A government agency tried to psychologically crush a citizen with a forged note and a box of tape. No code names, no spy gadgets, just a typewriter, a postmark, and intent. Keep that in mind as we turn the page. The next file isn't about one man. It's about a whole domestic spying effort by an agency that wasn't even supposed to operate at home. Operation CHAOS. There's a simple rule in the American spy playbook. The CIA looks outward, not inward. In the late 1960s, that rule bent. The Vietnam War was boiling. Protests filled campuses and capitals. Inside Langley, a question gained weight. Were foreign governments secretly steering the anti-war movement? The answer the agency wanted required peeking where it wasn't supposed to, at home. The code name was dry enough to pass in an elevator, Operation CHAOS. It began as a narrow tasker, map any real Soviet, Cuban or other foreign fingerprints on US descent. The assignment landed inside the CIA's counterintelligence world and grew fast. Field offices were told to collect. Station chiefs abroad were told to report on Americans travelling and meeting activists overseas. At home, cutouts and liaisons quietly fed information to build a fuller picture. What started as a question about foreign control slid into a habit of domestic surveillance. The files piled up, reports on marches and speak-outs, lists of organisers and donors, cables about who met whom in Paris, London or Stockholm, clippings, rumour, hearsay. If it might hint at a foreign hand, it went in. Over time, the project kept names on thousands of Americans and hundreds of groups, with an index that ballooned toward the six-figure mark. Once you create a cabinet labelled "just in case," it fills itself. On paper, the charter still said, "No domestic spying." In practice, the lines blurred. Some of the collection flowed through other agencies, some rode informal bridges, some piggybacked on programs that had started for foreign intelligence and drifted. The public didn't know to object because the public didn't know it existed. Inside the building, the justification stayed the same. If Moscow is puppeteering any of this, we have to know. Then the 1970s happened. Watergate, leaks, and the arrival of oversight with teeth. A presidential commission cracked open the door. The Senate's Church Committee shoved it wide. The picture that emerged showed an agency that had let a question become a pretext. Chaos wasn't the only problem, but it was a clean symbol. The Foreign-Only Service had built a domestic dossier on dissent and called it counterintelligence. Did they find a master puppet? Number. There were contacts, travellers, sympathisers, and the usual noise of a messy democracy, but not the grand foreign command post the worst memos imagined. The cost was trust. When the story hit daylight, reforms followed. rules clarified, walls rebuilt, reporting to Congress made real. The phrase, "the CIA doesn't spy on Americans," went back into the handbook with a bolder underline. Hold that image of the walls being rebuilt, because the next file shows how easily influence can flow without a wiretap, through relationships with the people who shape what you read in the morning. The Church Committee found those too. Next up, CIA media ties, mockingbird relationships. You wake up, pour coffee, unfold the morning paper. The byline is familiar. The source is anonymous. The story nudges opinion just a little. During the Cold War, the CIA didn't just collect secrets, it cultivated the people who shape what the public thinks. The popular nickname you've heard is Operation Mockingbird. The documented part, what the Church Committee actually confirmed, is quieter and more precise. A network of covert relationships with journalists and outlets, some witting, some unwitting, used to plant, shape, or kill stories. Here's how it looked from inside the file cabinet. Case officers kept lists of press contacts, stringers, freelancers, foreign correspondents, a few editors who could be counted on to pass a question along, ask a favour, or carry a line into print. Sometimes that meant placing stories overseas to influence foreign audiences and, inevitably, having those stories blow back into US media. Sometimes it meant suppressing a piece that might expose an operation. In a few cases, it meant paying retainers or covering travel in exchange for cooperation. The aim wasn't a cartoon mind control ray. It was leverage. If you want to tilt a narrative about a coup, a defector, a missile test, a famine, you don't need to own a newsroom. You need a few bylines in the right places, a friendly foreign desk, and timing. In testimony, the agency acknowledged these ties and promised reforms, no more paid relationships with accredited US journalists. The committee's findings didn't bless every rumour on the internet, but they did something more important. They proved the core mechanism was real. A famous metaphor from the era called the whole apparatus the mighty Wurlitzer. You press a key in one office and somewhere a tune plays in print or on the radio. It wasn't all-powerful. It was persistent. The files showed memos about assets of influence, discussions about which outlet had reach, and the kind of careful grooming that turns a favour into a habit. Not everyone who crossed paths with the agency knew. That's part of why this still stings, because it exploited the grey area between sourcing and steering. What's the damage? Trust, again. Journalists live on credibility. If even a slice of the press corps is secretly on intelligence payrolls or taking cues they don't disclose, every byline gets a little suspect. That was the Church Committee's worry, not that the CIA ran the media, but that it ran through parts of it, quietly, for years. Here's the important boundary to keep. The documented record shows covert relationships and story placement, not a single monolithic op controlling every headline. We stick to the receipts. And those receipts are enough to change how you read the morning paper. From shaping stories to capturing them wholesale. Our next chapter widens the lens to a global interception system that governments were shy to name until parliaments forced the conversation. Echelon. Picture a globe with 5 pins, Washington, London, Ottawa, Canberra, Wellington. Draw cables between them and label the network with a bland rubber stamp name, Echelon. For decades, the Five Eyes partners, the US, UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, quietly built a shared system to intercept, filter and analyse communications that moved through satellites, microwave relays and international switches. The idea wasn't new. The scale was. Think of the world's phone calls, faxes and later email flying through the air like confetti. Most people see noise. A signals intelligence service sees patterns. Echelon's job was to catch the stream at key choke points, big satellite downlinks, overseas relay stations, foreign gateways, then sort it with automated tools. The jargon talked about dictionaries, lists of selectors and keywords that told the machines what to keep and what to throw away. One partner might task the net for trade secrets moving in Asia, another might look for proliferation hints in the Middle East, another might chase a terror cell's travel plans. The countries split the world like a pie and compared slices. Because this ran across borders, it also ran into a legal grey zone. Each country had rules about spying on its own citizens. But traffic doesn't carry passports. A message from Paris to São Paulo might bounce through a London dish or a Canadian station. A fax sent in Tokyo might splash down in Australia before hopping on. The system's strength, global reach, was also its ethical fault line. When you vacuum whole rivers of data, even with filters, incidental capture is a feature, not a bug. For years, officials answered questions with a shrug, no comment. Then, Parliament started asking out loud. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, public reports in Europe and abroad described a real Allied interception network by name, complete with place markers you can point to on a map. Menwith Hill in the UK, Pine Gap in Australia, other dishes staring at the sky like white golf balls. The language was careful, but the acknowledgement was there. Capability existed, cooperation was deep, and rules were evolving. Why does Echelon land on lists like this? Because it shows how a conspiracy can be mundane and massive at the same time. No trench coats, no midnight meetings, just big antennas, fibre taps, and a shared tasking sheet. The power comes from scale. If you can see enough of the world's traffic, you can learn things no one meant to tell you. Hold that thought as we slide from sky dishes to server racks. After September 11th, surveillance moved even closer to where messages live, inside the Internet's biggest companies and the backbone itself. Next up, Prism/mass surveillance. Open a metal door and the air hits like winter, server room cold, racks blink, fans hum, and somewhere upstairs a lawyer drafts a paragraph that will make all of this legal. After September 11th, the hunt for needles moved into the haystack itself. The code name on the leaked slides was blunt: Prism. Here's the simple version, hidden under a lot of jargon. Intelligence agencies built two main avenues into the world's communications. One was upstream, tapping the backbone as data crossed the Internet's long-haul lines. Think fibre optic cables, splitters, and filters that sifted passing traffic for selectors, email addresses, phone numbers, chat handles, linked to targets. The other avenue was Prism, which didn't grab traffic mid-flight. It tasked the big tech companies to hand over data on specific selectors under secret court orders. Different pipes, different legal instruments, same gravity. The stream was suddenly closer than it had ever been. If you picture a spy in a trench coat, update the image. It's a systems engineer reading a warrant in a secure room, a compliance team uploading bundle to a government inbox, an analyst typing a selector into a console that lights up green. The program lived in slides and briefings no one outside was meant to see, until a contractor walked those slides out the door and the world learned new words. Section 702, Minimization, Foreignness, Determination. The point wasn't a cartoon super snoop watching everyone all the time. It was scale. If selectors can be added with a keystroke and storage is cheap, surveillance becomes a capacity, not a case-by-case exception. The official defense sounded tidy. Targets must be foreign, data on Americans is minimized, oversight exists, inspectors general, secret courts, congressional committees, and parts of that are true. But the leaks showed the edges where reality frayed, how foreign can be inferred from metadata that isn't perfect, how communications to or about a target can sweep in bystanders, how a query box meant for foreign intel can be used later by someone searching a domestic name. When you build a warehouse, people will try the door. Why does this land on a list of conspiracies that turned out to be true? Because for years, mass collection sounded like late-night radio talk. Then the slides hit front pages, program names, diagrams, dates. The debate stopped being, is this real? And started being, how much of this should we allow? Laws shifted, rules tightened, the pendulum moved and keeps moving. But one lesson doesn't swing. The easiest secret to grow is the one you can write in code instead of ink. From cloud accounts and fiber splits, let's drop back into the physical world of glass windows and a view of San Francisco Bay, where a single room behind a locked door showed how the backbone itself became a listening post. Room 641, A, AT&T. On the 7th floor of AT&T's switching center at 611 Folsom Street in San Francisco, there's a beige hallway with a locked door that once mattered a lot more than it looked. On the other side sat Room 641A, a windowless space with racks of gear and a single purpose. Make a copy of the internet traffic passing through the building and feed that copy to government filters. Here's the simple picture. The building handled a fat slice of the Bay Area's backbone, fiber optic cables carrying phone calls and internet packets. AT&T installed an optical splitter. Think of it like a plumbing T-junction for light. One stream kept going to its normal destination. The other stream peeled off into 641A. Inside, specialized boxes, famously from Naru's, an analytics company, digested the duplicate. Who's talking to whom? What protocols? What keywords? What selectors? If you're used to thinking a tap means a single line somewhere, update the image. This was the backbone itself, mirrored at scale. How do we know any of this? A technician named Mark Klein saved internal diagrams and wrote a detailed declaration years later. He described the gear, the cabling, the labels on the racks, and the AT&T work orders that made the mirror possible. The upshot, this wasn't a rumor about a black van. It was a building, a room, a splitter, a rack list. Legally, the story spans 2 eras. Before reforms, programs justified as emergency warrantless collection reached into domestic switches. After a public clash and court fights, remember the EFF's case against AT&T, Congress rewired the rules with the FISA Amendments Act of 2008, expanding authority and, controversially, giving telecoms retroactive immunity. The jargon shifted, but the physics didn't. Once a copy of the stream exists, analysis becomes a matter of software, policy, and how wide you open the filter. Why does 641A still hit a nerve? Because it collapses the distance between the abstract and the real. Mass surveillance can sound like a theory fight. A door with a card reader in a building you can point to is not a theory. It's also a lesson in how infrastructure choices ripple. If traffic for 2 strangers in San Jose happens to cross Folsom Street, their bits took a detour through a room they didn't know existed. Hold that thought as we widen the lens from a single room to a global habit that strained friendships. It wasn't just adversaries in the net. Allies felt the wire too. Next, NSA bugging allies. Imagine you're an elected leader of a friendly nation. You've shaken hands on stages, stood for photos, traded toasts. Then you learn the Americans were listening to your personal phone. That was the jolt in 2013 when leaked files showed the NSA's net didn't stop at adversaries. It snagged allies too. Germany's chancellor was the face of the shock. Reports said her cell number sat in a tasking file. The public line had always been polite. We focus on threats. The private practice was sharper. Intelligence is intelligence, and relationships don't erase curiosity. This wasn't one rogue office, it was a system built for reach. A joint CIA/NSA unit called the Special Collections Service quietly parked antennas and collection gear in embassies and consulates around the world, rooftop domes that looked like garden sheds, rooms with windows that never opened. Inside, teams tuned to local airwaves, government cell networks, microwave links, satellite downlinks. Elsewhere, analysts tasked allied numbers the same way they tasked hostile ones. Add a selector, wait for hits, harvest the metadata, and, if possible, the content. The blast radius went beyond one leader's phone. Files described monitoring at the United Nations, targeting of EU institutions, and a now famous note about a US official handing over contact lists that included numbers for 35 world leaders. The point wasn't to blackmail friends. It was the same logic that drives all signals intelligence. Knowing what someone plans to do tomorrow beats arguing about what they did yesterday. That logic crashes into politics when the someone is supposed to be on your Christmas card list. The backlash was immediate. Summoned ambassadors, frozen faces at press conferences, references to history that stung, a German leader invoking memories of state spying. Washington's response mixed denial with recalibration. Reforms followed, public speeches about limits, new internal rules for targeting Allied leaders, and a policy memo that promised stronger privacy protections for non-Americans. But here's the durable truth. Capability lives on a shelf. Tools don't disappear. Policies decide where they're aimed. Why does this count as a conspiracy that turned out to be true? Because for years, saying the US spies on allies sounded like barstool cynicism. Then the paperwork landed. Program names, slides, targeting notes. The world didn't end. The phone calls didn't stop. Everyone still needed everyone else. But a layer of innocence burned away. When a friendly leader holds up a phone now, they know what it can be. A two-way device. Voice out, secrets in. From wiretaps on friends to a long con on everyone else, the next story isn't about listening to calls, it's about reading nations' encrypted messages because the box that made the codes was secretly yours. Crypto AG, Operation Rubicon. Imagine buying a safe from a company in a neutral country, famous for engineering, and discovering decades later that the lock was designed to be picked by the very people who sold it to you. That's the heart of Crypto AG and the joint CIA-BND operation known as Rubicon. For much of the Cold War, and beyond, governments that couldn't build their own encryption gear turned to a Swiss firm, Crypto AG, for code machines and later digital systems. The pitch was irresistible. Neutral Switzerland, trusted hardware, math that would keep prying ears out. Ambassadors used them, generals used them, spies used them. It felt like buying silence in a box. Behind the brochure was a partnership. US and West German intelligence quietly took control of the company, steering designs so that certain models came with helpful weaknesses, predictable random number generators, biased key schedules, shortcuts only the designers knew. To customers, messages looked scrambled into snow. To the owners of the back door, they looked like a crossword with half the letters already filled in. The reach was astonishing. More than 100 countries bought Crypto AG gear at one time or another. Rivals, friends of friends, even regimes Washington publicly scolded. Close allies got truly secure models or were warned off particular machines. Everyone else got hardware that looked unbreakable and wasn't. Cables about wars, coups, hostage crises, oil deals, arms shipments. Day after day, the traffic flowed, and the owners of the secret watched the world talk. There were scares. In 1992, an Iranian arrest of a Crypto AG salesman cracked the company's perfect cover. Whispers about weakened machines grew. Engineers inside sometimes asked why certain designs were so oddly generous to an eavesdropper. Still, the business rolled on, the brand stayed respected, and the operation lived under layers of deniability until reporting and declassifications finally told the story in plain terms. The intelligence coup of the century had been hiding in a product catalogue. Why does this one grab the imagination? Because it flips the spy movie inside out. It's not about stealing the key. It's about selling the lock. It shows a different kind of power. Shape the tool everyone uses, and you don't have to break in. You walk in. It also leaves a moral hangover. Plenty of bad actors were red because of this. So were entire populations whose leaders believed a Swiss logo meant safety. From secret ciphers to secret cables. Next, we'll dive under the Pacific where divers, drills, and a homemade watertight hut turned an enemy's seabed into a listening post. Operation Ivy Bells. Drop below the waves to a shelf of sea floor in the Sea of Okhotsk, cold, dark, and quiet as a vault. Somewhere down there, a Soviet Navy undersea cable carried unencrypted conversations between bases, so secure The Soviets figured that no one but fish could listen. In the 1970s, the US decided to prove them wrong. The codename was Operation Ivy Bells. Finding the cable was step one. Navy spooks studied shoreline maps and fishing charts, traced where a landline would likely enter the water, and then used a towed sled with sensors to sniff along the bottom for the telltale hum. When they found it, a specialized submarine settled nearby and a team of divers went to work. Think of a clamp that never breaks the insulation, an inductive sleeve that hugs the cable and hears the current inside without cutting it. Around that, they mounted a watertight pod stuffed with recorders and batteries, no puncture, no splice, just a stealthy hug and an ear pressed close. This wasn't a one-and-done raid. The pod recorded for weeks, spooling conversation onto tape. Periodically, the sub returned. Divers slipped out, unlocked the pod, swapped reels, and vanished again into the black. What came back up shocked analysts. Because the cable ran in home waters, Soviet officers often didn't encrypt. Schedules, maintenance headaches, readiness drills, base gossip, mundane details that, in bulk, painted a vivid picture of how the Soviet fleet actually operated. For intelligence planners, that was gold. Not just what they could do, but what they routinely did. The operations scaled. Newer taps, bigger pods, more tape, more insight. For years, the ocean kept the secret. Then a different kind of leak. A walk-in spy told the KGB what to look for. Soon after, a Soviet trawler accidentally snagged exactly the spot, and divers recovered the hardware, prize and proof. The line went dead, and one of the most daring wiretaps in history ended not with a bang, but with a boat pulling up a mystery cylinder from the deep. Why does Ivy Bells matter? Because it shows a different face of espionage. No Hollywood hack, no intercepted radio chat, just engineering and patience. A silent device wrapped around a wire in a sea no one else was supposed to be in. It also carries a lesson that repeats in this series. Security is often a habit, and habits get lazy. The Soviets assumed the seafloor was a wall. It was a door. From the seabed to the stratosphere of absurdity, a quick detour that still makes veterans shake their heads. A plan to turn a house cat into a spy. Acoustic Kitty. Picture a grey operations room where a handler whispers into a mic, "Release the asset," and a tech opens, a cat carrier. Acoustic Kitty was exactly what it sounds like, a 1960s CIA attempt to turn a house cat into a mobile listening device. Engineers and vets did the unthinkable. Implant a tiny microphone near the cat's ear canal, run a fine wire under the skin, and hide a transmitter along the spine with the antenna threaded into the tail. On paper, it was genius. A cat can drift across a park bench, saunter under a cafe table, curl up near a target's feet, no suspicion, perfect placement. Reality had notes. Step 1. Teach a cat to go where you tell it, and stay long enough to collect. Trainers tried food cues, sound cues, even designing routes from parked cars to embassy walls. The animal had its own opinions. Mid-mission, hunger barged in. A loud truck rolled past, and curiosity won. Cats are great at not doing what you need them to do. The legend of the first field test is brutal and memorable. The cat was released near a foreign compound in Washington and promptly wandered into traffic, ending the op in seconds. Declassified pages later softened the tale. Some tests worked in controlled settings, but the verdict was the same. Too distractible, too fragile, too expensive for the return. The project was shelved with a bureaucratic shrug that translates to, "We tried, let's never try that again." Why does Acoustic Kitty matter? Because it captures the manic creativity of Cold War tradecraft. If it could be imagined, someone funded a prototype. It's a reminder that not all conspiracies are dark. Some are just profoundly weird and still real. Next up in our quick hit lane, From Cats to Mail, a long-running program that opened and photographed Americans' international letters behind the scenes. HTLINGUAL. Walk into a back room of a post office in the 1960s. There's a steam wand, a stack of manila folders, a camera pointed at a table, and a tidy pile of letters that were never meant to stop here. The code name on the file is HTLINGUAL. The simple version: for 2 decades, the CIA quietly intercepted international mail, mostly letters moving between the US and the Soviet Union or China. Phase 1 was called a mail cover. Photograph the outsides, names, return addresses, postmarks, and feed those into index cards so analysts could map who wrote to whom. Phase 2 slid over the line. Open selected letters, copy what was inside, and send them on their way resealed so neatly the writer and recipient would never know. It wasn't one rogue tech with a kettle. It was a system. Postal workers flagged routes, couriers walked bags to a secure room, and trained hands used solvents, steam, and clever tools to lift flaps without ripping. A letter might be open on the table for 90 seconds, enough to snap a photo, enough to skim for a name, a hint, a phrase that would justify adding you to a list. Most of the targets were foreigners, scientists, exiles, students, or Americans corresponding abroad. Once your name lived on a card, it tended to stay. On the paperwork, it all sounds precise and measured. In life, it meant a government camera reading words you only meant for one pair of eyes, family gossip, love notes, political opinions that felt safer on paper than in a phone call. The program ran from the early 1950s into the 1970s, expanding in scope and ambition until investigations pried it open. When the Church Committee and other inquiries finally described HTLINGUAL out loud, the public learned a new phrase with an old sting. Your mail was not always your mail. Why does this matter? Because it shows how surveillance loves the routine. Not a dramatic wiretap, just letters, every day, made legible to a file cabinet. Next in our quick hit lane, the CIA's own uncomfortable self-portrait, the internal dossier of "Don't ever let this see daylight." Family jewels. In the summer of 1973, after Watergate cracked the country's patience, a new directive went out inside the CIA that boiled down to write down everything we did that we never want to explain to Congress. The result was a thick, secret bundle with a disarming nickname, the Family Jewels. It wasn't policy, it was a confessional. Managers collected memos about activities that might fall outside authority, which is bureaucrat speak for "don't let this see daylight." Inside were snapshots of 2 decades of grey and black, domestic spying on journalists and activists despite a foreign-only charter, opening Americans' international mail, HTLINGUAL, drugging and mind control experiments on unwitting subjects, MK Ultra and friends, black bag break-ins, tape recorders in hotel rooms, and plots against foreign leaders that read like the dark table of contents of the Cold War. The point wasn't to brag, it was damage control. If investigators came knocking, leadership needed to know where the landmines were. But once a ledger exists, it has a way of moving. In 1974, press reporting blew the door open on domestic spying. Soon the Senate's Church Committee pulled the jewels into the light, page by page. Years later, heavily redacted scans trickled out, black bars over paragraphs, but enough text showing to prove the bones. This wasn't rumour, it was record. Why does this matter in a list like ours? Because it's the CIA talking to itself, admitting the very categories people had been dismissed for suspecting. You don't have to accept every legend on the internet to see the core truth. Once secrecy becomes a habit, lines blur unless someone outside the room says stop. The jewels helped build that outside voice, real oversight with subpoena power. Close that file and you can feel the temperature change. We've been inside the machinery. Now we step into history, shaped by it. Coups and regime change plans that rearranged maps. First up, the one that still echoes in oil markets and street politics alike. 1953 Iran, Operation Ajax. Picture a tall, bookish prime minister standing before parliament and saying a simple radical thing: Iran's oil belongs to Iran. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh nationalised the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, ending a British deal that skimmed most profits to London while Iranian workers lived on little. The move was wildly popular at home and infuriating abroad. Britain pushed back with lawsuits and a crippling embargo. Then it asked an ally for help. Enter a joint plan with neat code names: Boot for the British, Operation Ajax for the CIA. The mission: remove Mossadegh, restore a pliable order, and reopen the wells on terms friendlier to the West. The field commander was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., a grandson of a president with a suitcase full of cash and contacts. He didn't storm a palace. He built a mood. How? Propaganda first, newspaper stories, planted rumours, background briefings to sour Mossadegh's image as a defender of democracy and paint him as a danger. Bribes next, payments to politicians, clerics, and street bosses who could summon crowds. Allies in uniform last, sympathetic officers waiting for a nudge. The Shah, young and nervous, signed decrees dismissing Mossadegh and naming General Fazlollah Zahedi as Prime Minister. The first push in mid-August 1953 wobbled. The Shah fled. For a moment it looked like the plot had collapsed. Then the second act. On August 19, 1953, hired toughs and loyalists clashed with Mossadegh's supporters. Tanks moved, units swung to the palace side, a radio station changed hands. By evening, Mossadegh's home was shelled, his government fell, and Zahedi announced himself in charge. The Shah returned to applause and a long memory of who had saved him. The oil, soon after, was reorganized under a Western consortium. If you zoom in, the mechanics look small. Pamphlets, payoffs, street theatre. Zoom out, and you see a hinge in history. Iran's brief democratic opening closed. Security services like SAVAK grew teeth, trained by friendly foreigners. Resentment fermented for a generation, turning into a revolution in 1979 that rewired the region and America's place in it. When people in Tehran shouted about foreign hands years later, they weren't guessing. They were remembering. Why is Ajax a proven conspiracy and not a myth? Because the paper trail exists, memos, reports, later acknowledgements. You don't need to believe every legend about who pushed which door. The broad picture is solid. Outside, powers toppled an elected leader to protect their interests, and the blowback never really stopped. From Tehran, we fly south to Santiago, another elected leader, another slow-motion squeeze, and another file of covert help that set the stage for tanks in the streets. 1973 Chile, pre-coup covert ops. Santiago, early 1970s, cafes full of talk, posters on walls, prices climbing, lines for basics, a country arguing with itself in public. Salvador Allende, a socialist elected in 1970, tried to push Chile down a new road, nationalizing copper, expanding social programs, squeezing old elites. In Washington, the mood was ice cold. The US wouldn't just wait and see, it would shape the weather. Two tracks emerged in secret memos. Track I. Use money and influence to undermine Allende politically, fund opposition parties and unions, back media that hammered his government. The newspaper El Mercurio became a favourite conduit, and tighten international credit so the economy creaked. The idea was simple: make the experiment look like failure. Track 2. A riskier lane. Encourage a military move that would block Allende before he could fully consolidate power. That second track collided with a name that mattered: General René Schneider, Chile's army chief. He believed in the Constitution, full stop, the Schneider Doctrine, no coup against a legal civilian government. Right-wing conspirators plotted to kidnap him to clear the path. Contacts and cash flowed from covert channels. The abduction attempt went sideways. Schneider was shot and later died. Official cables back then read like they'd been written with gloves on. Careful phrasing, denials of intent. History reads them more bluntly. Foreign hands helped set the table, and a man who stood for the rule of law was killed. The covert push didn't stop there. Money kept oiling strikes, bankrolling propaganda, and cultivating officers. Meanwhile, Chile's economy buckled, partly from internal missteps, partly from pressure. The phrase later tied to the White House, "make the economy scream," captures the posture, if not the paperwork. Squeeze until patience snaps. On September 11, 1973, tanks rolled, jets screamed over La Moneda, and the military seized power under Augusto Pinochet. Allende died in the palace. In the years that followed, arrests, torture centers, and disappearances redefined fear. How much of the coup itself was orchestrated from abroad remains debated. What's documented is the pre-coup shaping, covert funds, media manipulation, contacts with plotters, and a persistent intent to ensure Allende would not survive politically. Why does Chile sit in a list of conspiracies that turned out true? Because the declassified record shows a deliberate, sustained effort to bend another country's politics in the dark, not with speeches, but with suitcases and whispers. You don't need to imagine a puppet master, you just need to see a steady hand on the scale. From streets roiled by politics, we jump to a shadow army that slept for decades beneath Europe's calm. Networks meant to resist a Soviet invasion that sometimes bled into domestic terror. Operation Gladio. After World War II, Western Europe made a quiet promise to itself. If the Soviets ever roll in, we won't be caught flat-footed. So, in basements and barns and back rooms, a shadow layer was built. Stay-behind networks, small cells trained to hide, signal, sabotage, and guide resistance if invasion came. In Italy, the code name that eventually surfaced was Gladio, short sword. Here's the straightforward, documented part. Intelligence services, with help from allies, recruited and trained civilians and veterans, hid arms caches, built clandestine radio nets, and kept lists of contacts who could be activated on day one of a war. The logic was simple. If front lines collapse, the country still has tendons. These networks existed not only in Italy, but in several NATO countries and neutrals. For decades, they stayed off the books and out of the news. Then the Cold War ended, and the paperwork blinked in the light. In 1990, Italy's Prime Minister acknowledged Gladio's existence to Parliament. Investigations followed, parliamentary inquiries in Italy, Belgium, and elsewhere. Journalists found weapons dumps. Retired operatives talked carefully about training exercises, code names, contacts with Allied services. What had been a rumour became a file with tabs. The hard part, the part that keeps arguments alive, is scope and contamination. Some inquiries and court cases in Italy touched the phrase strategy of tension. A claim that far-right extremists, and in some accounts elements touching the security state, tried to stoke fear with bombings and blame the left to swing politics. Terrible attacks, like the Piazza Fontana bombing in 1969 and the Bologna Station massacre in 1980, became magnets for suspicion. Courts convicted neo-fascists in some cases. The full wiring diagram behind every attack remains contested. The proven thing is the stay-behind network. The debated thing is how far parts of it bled into, tolerated, or failed to prevent domestic terror. Why does Gladio belong here? Because it shows how a program built for a real threat can grow shadows of its own. Secrecy protects a country from invaders. It can also protect bad actors from daylight. When voters finally heard that hidden cells, radios, and armories had existed under their feet for 40 years, the shock wasn't just at the idea, it was at not being told. Hold that thought as we pivot to a different kind of fog of war, an attack at sea that helped unlock a wider conflict, and later, in the declassified quiet, looked nothing like what the headlines said that night. Gulf of Tonkin, second attack. Night water in the Gulf of Tonkin looks like a sheet of oil, black, glossy, twitching with false reflections. On August 4, 1964, 2 US destroyers, the Maddox and Turner Joy, stared into that blackness and saw danger everywhere. radar blips that came and went, sonar pings that sounded like torpedoes, white wakes that could have been boats, or just the sea having fun with nerves. Radio traffic spiked. Gunners fired into the dark. The captains sent urgent messages, "We're under attack." 2 days earlier, there had been a real clash. North Vietnamese patrol boats had approached the Maddox, shots were exchanged, and the incident was tangible. Hull, wakes, photos, bullet holes. This night was different. Weather was bad. The sea was choppy. Sonar can turn turbulence into ghosts, and radar loves to invent guests when lightning scratches the sky. Still, in the heat of the moment, uncertainty travelled up the chain wearing certainty's uniform. Multiple torpedo attacks became the phrase that mattered. In Washington, the appetite for clarity was strong and the patience for doubt was thin. Within hours, the US launched retaliatory strikes. Within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, a broad authorization that handed the White House a long runway to escalate the war in Vietnam. The vote wasn't close. The headlines wrote themselves. The machinery of war shifted up a gear. Later, the picture changed. Dispatches sent that same night contained hedges and second thoughts, reports revised, doubts logged, captains confessing they weren't sure what they'd seen. Years on, internal histories and declassified studies concluded that the August 4th attack likely never happened. Analysts found misread sonar, misplotted radar, and misinterpreted intercepts with bits of evidence that didn't fit quietly ignored in the rush to act. The truth wasn't a clean hoax. It was a fog bank of noise mistaken for signal, then lacquered into policy. Why does this belong in a list of conspiracies that turned out true? Because the narrative of the second attack, solid enough to sell Congress on a blank check, was built on a foundation that crumbled under daylight. The conspiracy wasn't that sailors lied. It was that uncertainty was packaged as certainty and rushed into the bloodstream of decision-making. The receipts live in logs and studies that read like a slow-motion facepalm. Hold that lesson as we pivot to a very different kind of covert mess, one that didn't start with radar ghosts, but with secret flights, back-channel deals, and money moving where the law said it couldn't. Next up, Iran-Contra. Start with a downed plane. October 1986, a cargo aircraft goes down over Nicaragua. The lone survivor, Eugene Hazenfuss, is captured with flight manifests, maps, and gear that say the quiet part out loud. Someone is secretly arming the Contra rebels fighting the leftist Sandinista government. In Washington, officials say, "Not us." In Beirut a month later, an Arabic magazine, Ash-Shirar, prints a different bombshell. The US has been selling missiles to Iran, an avowed enemy, supposedly to grease the release of American hostages in Lebanon. 2 stories, 1 thread. Pull it, and the scheme appears. US law, the Boland Amendments, had restricted federal support for the Contras. Inside the White House, a small National Security Council shop decided to keep the pipeline flowing off the books. Meanwhile, Iran, locked in a brutal war with Iraq, wanted Tau missiles and spare parts. Middlemen proposed a trade, send arms to Iran, get hostages released by groups with ties to Tehran, skim profits from the arms sales, send that money to the Contras. No Congress, no public debate. A workaround disguised as foreign policy. Names surface. Lieutenant Column Oliver North, the energetic NSC action officer, Admiral John Poindexter, National Security Advisor, Robert McFarlane before him. There were foreign cutouts, Swiss bank accounts, Israeli intermediaries, and a whiteboard logic that treated laws like speed bumps. When the stories broke, the office paper shredder ran hot. North's secretary famously tucked away a stack of memos in her boots to move them out of the building. It felt like a thriller until you realized it was government business. Then came the reckoning. The Tower Commission under President Reagan catalogued the chaos. A joint congressional investigation held televised hearings that glued the country to its TVs. An independent counsel brought charges. North was convicted on 3 counts, later vacated on appeal because his testimony to Congress had been immunized. Poindexter was convicted, also overturned on similar grounds. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger was indicted, then pardoned by President George H.W. Bush alongside several others on the eve of trial. The legal scoreboard was messy. The factual record wasn't. The arms for hostages idea happened, and profits were diverted to the Contras. Why does Iran-Contra belong on this list? Because it's a clean example of policy by conspiracy, a secret plan to do indirectly what the law forbade directly, sustained by deniability until documents, witnesses, and a crashed plane made denial impossible. Not every scandal rewrites a map. This one rewired trust. If the government can route around Congress with covert accounts and friendly middlemen, what else can it route around? From secret flights to a break-in that began with duct tape and ended with a presidency unraveling, we move to the archetype of the modern cover-up, Watergate. There's a reason Gate got glued to every scandal after 1972. Watergate is the blueprint, a dumb crime that unraveled into a proven conspiracy to obstruct justice from the Oval Office. Start at the bottom of a staircase in the Watergate complex. Night watchman notices tape over a door latch. Police find 5 burglars inside the Democratic National Committee offices with cameras, wiretap gear, and crisp $100 bills. They aren't freelance. Threads lead back to the president's re-election committee. Ex-CIA hands, a White House plumbers unit built to plug leaks and attack enemies. The campaign wins in a landslide anyway. Then the cover-up begins. The White House raises hush money, tells witnesses to stick to a story, and leans on the CIA to nudge the FBI off the case by whispering that the probe bumps into national security. That last move, trying to sick one agency on another to stall justice, will later be heard on tape. Meanwhile, 2 reporters keep pulling. A Senate committee starts asking sharper questions. Little lies keep breaking under bigger lights. Then the plot twist that makes Watergate different from rumor. Tapes. In July 1973, aide Alexander Butterfield lets slip that Nixon secretly recorded his own meetings. Now, it isn't, he said, she said. It's, let's hear the room. The president claims privilege. The courts say, hand them over. When a key recording, the smoking gun from June 23, 1972, finally surfaces, you can hear Nixon and H.R. Haldeman discussing the plan to get the CIA to rein in the FBI. That's not spin. That's intent. Along the way, the battle gets uglier. The Saturday Night Massacre. The president orders the special prosecutor fired. Top justice officials resign, rather than do it. The mysterious 18.5-minute gap on one tape, and a parade of aides hauled before cameras. Eventually, the House Judiciary Committee approves articles of impeachment, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, contempt of Congress. Party support evaporates. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon announces he will resign. Watergate isn't just a cautionary tale. It's proof that a conspiracy can be documented to the comma. People went to prison. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, John Mitchell, G. Gordon Liddy, among others. The system that failed at prevention worked at exposure. Subpoenas, courts, oversight, and, yes, a press corps that kept asking. From a White House cover-up to an outsider organization doing its own covert infiltration, we pivot to a case where the burglars wore religious lapel pins. Next, Operation Snow White, Scientology, a plot to plant operatives inside government offices and steal files, proven in raids and court. In the mid-1970s, a church built its own intelligence service and pointed it at the US government. The Church of Scientology's Guardian's Office launched a program with a fairy tale codename, Operation Snow White, and a very un-storybook goal: purge government files of anything negative about Scientology and its founder and steal more to know who was saying what. This wasn't a letter-writing campaign, it was infiltration. Operatives trained in basic tradecraft, aliases, forged IDs, lock-picking, took jobs inside federal offices, the IRS, Justice Department, FDA, even the US Attorney's Office. Once in, they copied and smuggled documents, tampered with files, and ran nightly exfil runs to feed a central cache. Some broke in after hours, rifled desks, and installed lookouts with two-way radios. The language in internal memos was bureaucratic but blunt. Identify hostile officials and neutralize the threat by getting the paper. Snow White was huge. Dozens of operatives worked across multiple cities. The paper flow was so heavy they built systems to label, summarize, and route what they found. It wasn't just find the bad memo. It was map the bureaucracy. Who signs off on what? Which agent holds the file? Which office to avoid? Where leaks would hurt the most? Think corporate org chart, but for the US government, drawn by a private spy shop. The tip-off came like many tip-offs do, a small arrest, then a bigger pattern. In 1977, the FBI raided Scientology offices in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles and carted out an avalanche, tens of thousands of documents that traced burglaries, wiretaps and thefts back to the leadership. Federal prosecutors followed the paper trail to the top of the Guardian's office. In 1979, 11 senior officials, including Mary Sue Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard's wife and the Guardian's office controller, pled guilty or were convicted in a D.C. case for conspiring to obstruct justice, forge government IDS, and steal government property. The church later reorganized its intelligence arm, but the record was already made. This was, by scale, the largest known infiltration of the US government by a non-state group. Snow White lands on this list because it erases the line between paranoid rumor and case file. There were real code names, real break-ins, real moles at real desks, and courtroom outcomes you can point to. No mystique required, just a plan executed with discipline until the locks clicked behind the people who wrote it. From outside operatives to an inside federal fiasco, next up is a law enforcement operation that let guns walk into cartel hands and then lost track of them, a TF Fast and Furious. On paper it sounded clever, follow the guns up the ladder. In practice it became a fiasco nicknamed for a movie about cars. The ATF's Operation Fast and Furious, Phoenix, 2009 to 2011, set out to map cartel supply chains by watching straw buyers, locals with clean records who purchase guns for traffickers, then tracking those weapons into Mexico to identify bosses and stash houses. The tactic had a fatal flaw. They let the guns walk. Here's how it worked. Agents watched buyers roll into shops with envelopes of cash, purchase trunkloads of AK-style rifles, 50 caliber rifles and pistols, and drive away. Instead of seizing the guns immediately, teams tried to keep surveillance long enough to catch higher-ups. But surveillance breaks in the real world. Traffic, terrain, bad luck, too few cars for too many targets. The result? Hundreds, then thousands of guns vanished into cartel pipelines with ATF paperwork as the only leash. Agents on the ground sounded alarms. They wrote emails, pushed supervisors, pleaded to interdict. The answer, again and again, hold off. The big case needs the big fish. Then, December 2010, US Border Patrol agent Brian Terry is shot and killed near Nogales, Arizona. At the scene, 2 rifles are recovered. Serial numbers match Fast and Furious purchases. The scandal explodes. Congressional hearings followed. Whistleblowers testified about orders to stand down. The Justice Department's Inspector General later issued a blistering report. Sloppy oversight, poor coordination with prosecutors, a strategy that gambled with public safety, and misleading information sent to Congress early on. Careers ended. A TF leadership in Phoenix was reassigned or resigned. Senior DOJ officials took heat. Mexico fumed. Crime scene guns kept tying back to a US operation they hadn't been told about. Years later, Fast and Furious weapons still turned up at murders and cartel busts. Why does this count as a conspiracy that turned out true? Because the plan was to do something the public would never have approved if asked plainly. Allow known traffickers to arm violent gangs on purpose in hopes of a later payoff. It wasn't a rogue cowboy at a gun counter. It was an approved tactic with meetings, memos, and a name. The intent aimed up the chain. The outcome fell on bystanders and a US agent's family. From a law enforcement own goal to a corporate one so big it fogged city air. Next up is a global car maker that wrote software to cheat emissions tests, Volkswagen Dieselgate. In a lab, the wheels spin but the road stands still. The car sits on rollers, the hood closed, the steering wheel perfectly straight. Sensors watch. A hose sniffs the exhaust. On paper, it's science. On the road, it's life. Volkswagen's Dieselgate lived in the gap between the two. Diesel was VW's moonshot. Clean diesel would give you torque, range, and guilt-free tailpipes. In the lab, the numbers sang. Out on the street, a small university team strapped portable analyzers to a couple of VW diesels and went for a drive. The readings were absurd, many times higher nitrogen oxides, NOx, than the same cars showed on the test stand. They double-checked, same result. They told regulators. The regulators asked VW, and VW said what big companies say at first. It's a calibration issue, a quirk, we'll look into it. The truth was a line of code with a purpose. The engine control unit recognized the test, wheels turning but no steering input, speeds that match the lab's script, a tidy temperature window, and flipped into a special clean map, maximum exhaust gas recirculation, aggressive aftertreatment, just enough fuel to keep NOx low. Drive out of the lab pattern and the software quietly switched back to road mode. More pep, better mileage, far more NOx. In some conditions, dozens of times the legal limit. One car, two personalities, lab saint, street sinner. When cornered by data, the company's story crumbled. Investigators pulled threads, emails, software logs, meeting notes, and the picture sharpened. This wasn't a one-off technician gone rogue. It was a systematic cheat rolled into millions of cars worldwide. The fallout arrived fast. CEOs resigned. Prosecutors knocked. In the US, VW pled guilty to criminal charges, paid billions in fines and buybacks, and parked fleets on airfields to be scrapped. Engineers and executives faced charges. Some served time. Around the world, other brands were dragged into retests. The phrase defeat device moved from engineering textbooks to evening news. Why does Dieselgate belong here? Because it shows how a conspiracy can hide in plain code. No layers, no trench coats, just software toggling a mask on and off, confident that most people would never think to measure the air while the car was actually rolling past a school. It also shows how truth travels now. A small team with portable gear can tip a giant. From engines to interest rates, the next scandal lives in chat logs and trader jokes. Banks nudging the world's benchmark numbers for profit. Libor/FX rigging. Start with a number most people never see, Libor, the London interbank offered rate. Each day, select banks told a committee what interest they'd pay to borrow from one another. Average those submissions, trim the outliers, and you get a benchmark used to price trillions in loans, mortgages, swaps. Nudge it by a hair, and you move money from one pocket to another all over the world. Traders figured out the hair was movable. Inside chat windows with names that aged badly. The cartel, the bandits club, derivatives traders swapped winks and favours. Can you shade 3-month Libor a touch lower today? A trader would ask a bank's submitter, the person who typed the official number. Why lower? Because the trader was long positions that gained if the fixing ticked down a basis point or two. Tomorrow, the favour might flip directions, tiny tweaks, huge stakes. During the financial crisis, another twist appeared. Lowballing, where banks understated their own borrowing costs to look healthier than they were. Different motive, same effect. The truth in the benchmark bent. Regulators eventually pried open the logs. The evidence wasn't a grand mathematical hack. It was banter, jokey requests, promises of bottles of champagne, mate, you owe me, and then the numbers lining up just enough times to stop looking like coincidence. Banks across continents were hit with multi-billion-dollar fines, desks were disbanded, traders were charged, and some went to prison. The benchmark itself was redesigned and, in many markets, retired in favour of transaction-based rates that are harder to game. Now slide from interest rates to foreign exchange, the biggest market on Earth. Each day, a snapshot called the WM/Reuters 4 p.m. London fix set a reference price. For years, chat rooms full of top-tier FX traders shared client order books, coordinated timing, and pushed the price in the 1-minute fixing window, front-running and banging the close to clip a near-riskless profit. Again, the receipts were ugly in a very human way. If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Bravado, screenshots, and price action that jumped exactly when the fix needed a nudge. More record fines followed. Compliance walls went up. The most infamous rooms were shuttered. Why does this belong on our list? Because it's a reminder that not every conspiracy wears a trench coat. Some wear Bloomberg chat and a necktie. Move a benchmark by a whisker and the world pays you, 1 basis point at a time. From numbers on a screen to pills in a bottle. Next up is a case where marketing, money, and medicine formed a triangle, with criminal pleas at the end. Purdue Pharma, OxyContin. Picture a sales meeting where the slide says, pain is the 5th vital sign. The drug is called OxyContin. The pitch, powerful relief with low addiction risk, thanks to a slow-release shell. Doctors nod. Patients are desperate. The check's clear. That room is where a public health disaster got its marketing plan. Here's the spine of the story. Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin in the mid-1990s and trained an army of reps to tell doctors that because the pill released oxycodone over time, it was less addictive. They waved a tiny, decades-old letter in a medical journal as if it were proof, called Withdrawal Pseudo-Addiction. The solution was more opioids, and pushed a mantra, titrate to effect, that nudged doses higher when pain persisted. Sales calls targeted high-volume prescribers. Speaker fees and fancy dinners greased the path. Coupon cards and glossy brochures did the rest. The market responded. Prescriptions soared, including 80 milligram and 160 milligram tablets that packed a lot of drug into a small disc. People discovered you could crush or dissolve the pill to defeat the time release and get the whole dose at once. Clinics turned into pill mills. Addiction and overdoses climbed. Communities that had never seen a heroin problem suddenly had one because when the pills ran out, withdrawal didn't. This isn't just a morality tale, it's a case file. In 2007, a Purdue affiliate and 3 executives pled guilty to misbranding OxyContin, admitting that marketing had misled doctors and patients. In 2020, Purdue pled guilty to 3 federal felonies, conspiring to defraud the United States by undermining lawful controls and to violate the anti-kickback statute, including paying to influence an electronic health record system's prescribing prompts and funneling money to high-writing doctors. The company agreed to massive penalties. Separate civil suits against Purdue and the Sackler family, its owners, led to multi-billion-dollar settlements and years of legal war over accountability and how much protection the family could buy in bankruptcy court. Strip the legalese and the conspiracy is plain, a coordinated campaign to downplay risk, upsell dose, and steer prescribing, backed by payoffs and a torrent of sales data. The damage wasn't abstract. It had names, funerals, and grandparents raising toddlers because the middle generation disappeared. Why does Purdue belong here? Because it shows how a conspiracy can operate in boardrooms and break rooms, not basements, PowerPoints, quotas, educational programs that quietly turn medicine into marketing. When the receipts finally surfaced, the admissions weren't couched. The company said the quiet part in court. From boardrooms, we swing back to the shadows of the early Cold War, where the US quietly imported Nazi-affiliated scientists to jumpstart rockets and labs. Pattern interrupt number 2 begins with Project Paperclip. At the end of World War II, US officials faced a blunt choice: keep Nazi Germany's best scientists out of Soviet hands, or out of America. They chose the first part. The program's public face was bland, Project Paperclip. The reality was a pipeline that scrubbed resumes, waved through pasts that wouldn't survive a job interview today, and resettled hundreds of German scientists and engineers in US labs, bases and universities. Start with rockets. Werner von Braun and his team had built the V-2, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, in underground factories where prisoners did the labour and thousands died. After the war, that same brain trust shipped to American proving grounds. New names, new clearances, new projects, Redstone, Jupiter, and eventually the Saturn V that put people on the moon. The Space Race trophy sits in a glass case built with parts of this decision. Paperclip wasn't just rocketry. Doctors and chemists came over too, some with records that raised hard questions. Immigration files were massaged so prior party or SS ties wouldn't stop visas. Internal memos balanced phrases like valuable expertise against political risk. The logic was Cold War arithmetic. If we don't hire them, Moscow will. Ethics took the back seat on the bus. Was it a conspiracy? Not in the sense of a single smoky room. It was a coordinated, classified policy to import talent while minimizing the paper trail of what that talent had done and where. You can argue that the decision helped win the Cold War and reach the moon. You can also say, without flinching, that it braided American triumphs to terrible compromises and left survivors of the camps and tunnels staring at headlines about parades for men who once walked factory floors lined with corpses. Paperclip's lesson isn't simple. Two things can be true. The rockets worked, the record was dirty. When you see a gleaming launch in archival footage, remember the quiet file folders that made it possible. From imported scientists to imported strangeness, our next deep cut peeks at a lesser-known late MK Ultra spin-off that chased exotic ways to sway the mind, Project MKOften. If MK Ultra was the umbrella, Project MKOften was one of the stranger showers under it. Late 1960s into the 70s, CIA, with DoD partners, went shopping for exotics, anything that might bend mood, belief, or behavior in a way useful to operations. Think of it as a catch-all for unconventional influence research. The paperwork that survives is patchy, but the through line is clear. Contracts with toxicology labs and psych researchers to probe the behavioral effects of new pharmaceuticals, plant extracts, and odd chemical mixes. Forays outside normal academia to non-traditional consultants, people who claimed insight into occult practices, ritual, trance, astrology, faith healing. Not because the agency became mystic, but because it was casting a wide net. If a belief moves people, can we map it, mimic it, steer it? Some trials looked like straight pharmacology with weird endpoints, suggestibility, compliance, confusional states. Others logged cultural levers, symbols and settings that tip mood. What MKOften didn't produce was a magic switch. Like Midnight Climax and Edgewood, results sketched limits, not superpowers. Lots of noise, little signal. As post-Watergate oversight tightened, funds dried up, sub-projects were terminated, and the stranger vendors were shown the door. The legacy is less spells in a basement and more a caution. Under the banner of national security, a bureaucracy will try almost anything that sounds plausible until someone outside says no. Next, decades-long vacuuming of international telegrams, Project Shamrock. Walk into a plain office at a telegraph company in the 1950s. There's no cloak and dagger, just clerks, switchboards, and a locked pouch that leaves every night for a government address. Inside are copies of international telegrams, your cables to Paris, a scientist's notes to a conference in Tokyo, a shipping firm's price quote to Rio. The program name was as quiet as the handoff. Project Shamrock. It began in the final stretch of World War II and kept going for decades. The logic was simple. Telegrams were the email of their day, fast, terse, global. If you could read enough of them, you could map commerce, politics, espionage, and the daily pulse of a planet finding its post-war shape. US Signals Intelligence, the NSA's predecessors, and later the NSA itself, struck arrangements with major carriers, think Western Union, RCA, ITT, to provide regular bulk feeds of overseas cable traffic. The flow wasn't a trickle of warrants, it was a pipeline. Analysts sifted the stream for foreign targets, watch-listed names, and patterns that might whisper about spies, defectors, smuggling rings, or emerging crises. On paper, the program aimed outward. In practice, traffic doesn't wear flags. A cable from New York to Geneva might carry an American's private business. A message from Prague to Chicago might include a dissident's plea. Over time, Shamrock blurred into a broader habit. If a selector hit, keep it. If a name popped, watchlist it. Related efforts, like Minaret, which watchlisted specific people, including some US citizens, showed how a foreign intelligence net could tangle domestic speech when the rules live behind a classification stamp. For years, Shamrock lived in file cabinets and couriers' bags, defended by the words necessary and secret. Then the 1970s arrived. Watergate cracked the country's patience. Whistleblowers and reporters dug. The Senate's Church Committee pulled thread after thread and for the first time named programs like Shamrock and described how they worked. The picture wasn't of a Bond villain. It was of a bureaucracy that had normalized bulk collection without meaningful public rules. Telegram companies had cooperated quietly. Agencies had filed results diligently. No one had asked the people who wrote the cables if they consented. Why does Shamrock belong here? Because it shows how a conspiracy can be a routine. No break-ins, no flashing lights, just a daily pouch of copies, a sorting room, and an expanding index of who talked to whom across borders. It also sets up a through line to the Internet era. Once you convince yourself that collect first, filter later is acceptable, the only question left is how big the wire is. Shamrock was copper and paper. Its descendants hum in glass and code. Night runway, a Gulf Stream with no logo idles by a hangar. Inside the terminal, a small team moves a hooded prisoner in shackles, diaper, ear defenders, goggles that block light, no judge, no warrant you could read, a flight plan that will change mid-air. This is extraordinary rendition, the post-9/11 pipeline that moved suspects off the books to places where questions were asked in ways the public didn't learn about for years. Here's the mechanism. The CIA and partner services built a charter air fleet through cutout companies, fronts that billed like any contractor, fuel, crews, security services. Detainees were seized in Pakistan, the Balkans, North Africa, airports in Europe, wherever local allies would help, and flown onward to countries willing to interrogate hard or to CIA-run black sites. These sites were scattered: Poland, Romania, Lithuania in Europe, facilities in Afghanistan and elsewhere. On a map, they were just boxes. On the ground, they were windowless rooms, bright lights, loud noise, isolation, stress positions, sleep deprivation, techniques blessed by secret memos and sold under a euphemism: enhanced interrogation. The public line in those early years was careful, lawful, necessary, closely overseen. But receipts leak. Plane spotters logged tail numbers and odd flight paths. Aviation filings and invoices surfaced. Freed detainees told consistent stories from different continents. A CIA Inspector General report questioned both effectiveness and oversight. The Council of Europe and later European Court of Human Rights found that certain countries hosted sites and were legally responsible for abuses. US courts wrestled with the wall of state secrets even as cases like El Masri forced the facts into daylight abroad. Then came the long, blunt paragraph the country couldn't unread. In 2014, the US Senate released the declassified summary of its study on the detention and interrogation program. It concluded that the techniques were more brutal than previously acknowledged, less effective than claimed, and poorly documented, that key claims of ticking bomb breakthroughs didn't hold up, and that oversight was misled. Earlier, in 2005, a CIA official had ordered interrogation videotapes destroyed, an act that looked, even to allies, like the opposite of confidence. None of this says every target was innocent. Some detainees were senior terrorists. It says the system we built to hold and question them ran outside the law as the public understands it. Secret prisons, no charges, years in limbo, methods most Americans only learn about in history classes under darker headings. And it says that when the machine finally met sunlight, the justifications shrunk. Why does this belong in conspiracies that turned out to be true? Because for years the idea of US black sites sounded like rumour. Then flight logs, budgets, partner admissions, court rulings, IG reports, and a Senate study stacked into a picture you can no longer wave away. The file is thick enough to have edges. From hidden prisons to hidden paperwork, our next chapter shrinks from global flights to a strip of administrative power, national security letters, where shortcuts became a habit and oversight found the dents. Picture a form with a government seal and no judge's signature. It asks your phone company for billing records, subscriber info, email logs, maybe a list of who you called and when. It comes with a warning. Don't tell anyone. Not your lawyer, not your family, not your board. That's a national security letter, an administrative subpoena the FBI can issue on its own authority in national security cases. Before September 11th, NSLs existed but were narrow. After the Patriot Act, the criteria widened and the numbers exploded. Field offices could sign them with a supervisor's approval, and the built-in gag order meant the recipient had to keep quiet. The pitch inside the building was speed. Threats don't wait while you draft an affidavit and find a magistrate. Get the records fast, sort the rest later. Telecoms and financial firms learned the rhythm. An agent calls, a letter arrives, the data flows into a case file. Most Americans never hear the phrase because the letters forbid talking about the letters. Then the audits landed. The Justice Department's Inspector General took a hard look in 2007 and again afterward and found what oversight tends to find when a shortcut becomes a habit: misuse and sloppiness. Agents used so-called exigent letters, informal notes on FBI letterhead, to get phone records first and clean up the paperwork later, or never, despite rules that said don't do that. Files listed wrong legal citations. Some offices over-collected, vacuuming up records that weren't covered. Internal controls were described with polite phrases like inadequate and deficient, which in plain English means people were winging it. Meanwhile, the gag orders sparked constitutional fights. A handful of companies and librarians, backed by civil liberties groups, challenged NSLs in court. Judges ordered some gags lifted and called the scheme too broad as written. Congress tweaked the rules over time. The USA Freedom Act later forced periodic review of gags and let companies publish transparency reports with rough counts. The Bureau wrote new manuals, trained agents, tightened sign-offs, but the core remains. NSLs are a way to compel data without prior judicial approval, and the recipient may be silenced about it for years. Why does this belong in conspiracies that turned out to be true? Because for a long time, the public picture was, we follow the rules. The Inspector General's reports and court cases showed a parallel reality: rules bent, paperwork backfilled, and secret demands multiplied behind non-disclosure. You don't need to imagine a smoky room. You need to picture a printer in a field office, a stack of letters, and a culture that told itself, we'll fix the forms after we get the data. File that under a familiar pattern. Powers created in a crisis grow teeth, and only sunlight files them down. One more lesson before we close. Conspiracies don't just live in agencies and corporations. Sometimes they bloom in boardrooms and private clubs, then wander into Congress as whispers. Our final stop is an old American rumor with real testimony in its spine: the business plot, 1933. A retired Marine general with a gravelly voice and a chest full of ribbons sitting at his kitchen table while a visitor talks himself into a corner. The visitor is a smooth Bond salesman named Gerald Maguire. The general is Smedley Butler, two-time Medal of Honor, beloved by rank-and-file veterans, blunt as a brick. Maguire's pitch starts vague. The country needs stabilizing, business confidence. Europe has found a way to handle unrest and slides toward the point. Lead a veterans movement to restore order in Washington. The year is 1933 to 1934. The Great Depression is grinding people down. President Franklin D. Roosevelt is ripping up old playbooks, bank holiday, gold recall, New Deal. In boardrooms and private clubs, some men mutter the word dictator like a compliment. Mussolini has the trains running on time, hasn't he? The scheme Butler hears, in versions across several meetings, goes like this. Raise a private force of perhaps 500,000 veterans backed by big money. March or threaten to march. Pressure Roosevelt to accept a new assistant with sweeping control, the real power behind the chair. The sales job sweetens with talk of ample funding, friendly newspapers, and help from figures tied to the American Legion. Butler doesn't bite. He takes notes. He keeps the letters. Then he walks them to Congress. In late 1934, Butler testifies under oath before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, a House panel already probing subversive activities. He names names. Maguire, his employer, and a handful of wealthy backers, he says, were floated in conversation. Investigators haul in Maguire, who gives halting, unconvincing answers and admits to foreign trips and political errands that match pieces of Butler's story. Reporters go to work. Headlines say, "Fascist plot," because that's what the pitch smelled like in Europe at the time, a soft coup blueprint dressed in veteran khaki. What did Congress conclude? The committee's report, written in lawyerly prose, said there was evidence of an attempt to establish a fascist organization and that certain persons discussed using a veterans' army to pressure the government. It credited Butler's testimony as credible and said Maguire had made efforts along those lines. It did not lay criminal charges or fully map the money. Time ran out, witnesses clammed up, and the most powerful alleged backers stayed behind layers of denial and distance. Skeptics note the gaps. Supporters point to the paper trail Butler saved and the committee's cautious but firm language. So, where does that leave us? With a story that isn't tidy and doesn't need to be to earn its place here. A decorated general says he was asked to front a business-backed push to bend a president or replace him with a figurehead. A congressional committee says something real was afoot. No tanks in the streets, no arrests, but a glimpse of how power sometimes tries to move. Over lunch, through cutouts, wearing patriotism like a mask.